Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins. In the days of Gil-galad the High King, when the light of the two trees still lived in memory, and the voices of the Eldar rang clear across the waters of Linden, there came a darkness creeping from the east that would test all the valor and wisdom of the elder days. The Second Age was in its prime, and the kingdoms of men flourished under the long shadow of elven law. Yet in the hidden places of the world, an ancient malice stirred. It was in those days that the smiths of Ost in Edhill wrought their greatest works, and chief among them was Celebrimbor, grandson of Feanor, whose hands held still some echo of the fire that once burned in Formenos. In the halls, beneath the holly tree, his hammers rang, and there was joy in that sound, for it spoke of creation and beauty, of craft wedded to wisdom. Yet even as the Gwaith I Mirdan sang at their forges, a shadow fell upon their work, though they knew it not. From Mordor, that land of ash and flame which lay like a wound upon the eastern borders of Middle-earth, there came one who named himself Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. Fair was his form and gracious his speech, and to the ears of the elven-smiths his words seemed filled with ancient wisdom. Of the making of things of power he spoke, of rings that might preserve and protect, of craft that could hold back the decay of years and keep the beauty of elder days from fading. And the hearts of the Noldor were kindled, for in his words they heard an echo of their ancient desire to rival the works of the Valar themselves. But Gil-galad the Wise looked upon this stranger with eyes that had seen the light of Valinor, and in his heart there grew a shadow of doubt. For though Annatar's form was fair, there was about him something that spoke not of the music of creation, but of dominion and binding. Long did the High King ponder, walking in the twilight upon the shores of Linden, listening to the endless voices of the sea. And in those voices he heard whispers of warning, as if Ulmo himself breathed unease upon the waters. To Elrond, who was as a son to him, Gil-galad spoke his doubts. "There is a shadow upon this one who comes bearing gifts," said he. "Though his words are honey and his form seems fair, my heart misgives me. For I have looked upon the faces of the Maiar in the days of my youth, and this one's light seems borrowed, not born from within." Thus it was that when Annatar came to the shores of Linden, seeking audience with the High King, Gil-galad would not receive him, though many counselled otherwise. "Let him go to Ost in Edhill," said the king, "if gifts he would give and counsel offer. But here under my roof he shall not come, for I trust not the light that burns in his eyes." Yet in Eregion, Celebrimbor hearkened to the words of the stranger, and in the secret chambers of the Mirdain, the work began that would in after days bring such sorrow to Middle-earth. For Annatar taught them much of the making of rings of power, and under his guidance they wrought many works of wonder. 7 rings they made for the dwarf lords under the mountain, and 9 for mortal men doomed to die. But in secret, unknown to Annatar, Celebrimbor wrought 3 rings of surpassing beauty and power: Vilya mightiest of all, Annaria the red, and Nenya adorned with adamant. Far away in the fires of Mount Doom, in the Samath Nar, where the heat of the earth's heart burned eternal, another work was taking shape. There in secret Sauron, for such was Annatar's true name, forged in malice and treachery, the Master Ring, the one that would command all others. Into this ring, he poured his malice and his will to dominate all life. And when it was complete, he set it upon his hand and spoke the ring spell for the first time. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. And in that hour, all who wore the lesser rings felt his presence and knew themselves betrayed. The elves perceived his treachery at once, for the three had not touched his hand, and they removed their rings and hid them, and never again would they be deceived by the fair form of the enemy. But the 9 were trapped, and their bearers fell one by one under the shadow of the ring lord, becoming wraiths and servants of his will. Thus began the war that would shake the foundations of Middle-earth, as Sauron revealed himself in his malice and sent forth his armies from the Black Land. The Second Age was drawing toward its end, though few then living could foresee the length of shadow that lay ahead, or know that in the ashes of that war would be planted the seeds of an even greater darkness yet to come. In Lindon, Gil-galad looked eastward and saw the fires kindling upon the horizon, and he knew that the time of hidden malice was ended and the hour of open war was at hand. The greenwood the Great had stood since the elder days, its roots drinking deep from waters that remembered the music of creation. In those ancient halls of leaf and shadow, where the golden light filtered through branches older than the kingdoms of men, there dwelt Orifer and his woodland realm. Here the sylvan elves had made their home, far from the tumults of the western shores, living in harmony with root and branch, with deer path and hidden dell. But now a change came upon the forest, subtle as the shift from summer to autumn, yet pregnant with foreboding. The trees themselves seemed to whisper of unease, their leaves rustling with voices that spoke of shadow creeping from the south. The great oaks that had weathered storms beyond Count now trembled, not from wind, but from some deeper disturbance that ran through the very earth beneath their roots. Orifer the king walked among his people in those days with eyes grown troubled, for he who had dwelt long in Doriath before its fall knew well the signs of darkness spreading. The deer fled from certain glades where once they had grazed in peace, and the streams ran slower, as if reluctant to flow toward the southern borders of the wood. Most telling of all, the stars seemed dimmer when glimpsed through the canopy, as though some mist rose from the land to veil their ancient light. It was Thranduil, son of Orifer, who first brought word of the shadow's source. Long had he ranged the southern borders of the realm, swift and silent as the wood elves of old, and his eyes were keen to mark all changes in the wild. Upon a day when the sun hung red through the morning mist, he came before his father's throne with tidings that chilled the hearts of all who heard. "My lord and father," said he, "I have looked upon a sight that fills me with dread. In the south, where our borders march with the Vale of Anduin, a hill rises that was not there in the days of our youth. Dark it stands against the sky, and no tree grows upon its slopes, though the forest pressed close all around. Upon its summit stands a tower of black stone, and from its windows comes no light, yet from within I felt the weight of watching eyes." The court of Orifer fell silent at these words, for all knew that no work of elven hands could rise so swiftly, and the power that could command stone to grow like a living thing spoke of malice beyond the common wiles of orcs or wolves. The king himself grew pale, for in his heart stirred memories of Angban's threat in the days of his youth, when Morgoth's shadow lay heavy upon all the north. What manner of folk have come to dwell in this dark tower? Asked Orifer, though his voice suggested he feared the answer. No folk that love the light, replied Thranduil. I saw shapes that moved in shadow, tall and terrible, clad in black mail that gleamed not with any wholesome light. And there were others, smaller but no less fearsome, whose eyes burned like coals in the darkness. They have begun to delve deep into the hill, and the sound of their hammers carries far upon the night wind. The very trees lean away from that place as though they would flee if they could tear their roots from the earth. Long pondered Orifer upon these tidings, walking alone in the deepest groves where the song of nightingales had once brought peace to his heart. But now even the birds fell silent, and in the rustling of leaves he heard warnings carried on every breeze. At last he called his captains to council, and among them were many whose names would be remembered in the songs of after days. Amdir of Lorien, who had come from the south, with his own people seeking refuge from the growing shadow, and Galion, keeper of the king's halls, and many others whose wisdom was deep and whose valor had been tested in the wars against the darkness of old. Lords of the woodland realm, said Orifer, the shadow spreads, and we can no longer dwell in peace pretending that the darkness will pass us by. This hill of which my son speaks can be no natural thing, but must be raised by the same power that has corrupted the rings and betrayed the trust of the Mirdan. The time has come to choose. Shall we flee deeper into the wood and hope that the trees will hide us? Or shall we take counsel with Gil-galad and stand with the wise against the darkness? Long they debated through the watches of the night, while the wind sighed through the branches overhead and carried with it the scent of smoke from far-off fires. Some counselled flight, remembering the ruin that had come upon Doriath when it meddled in the wars of the Silmarils. Others spoke for war, saying that no retreat could serve if the shadow covered all the world. But in the end, it was Amdir who spoke the words that swayed the council. My lord, said he, I have seen what comes of those who think to hide from the darkness. In Lorien, we watched as the shadow crept ever closer, consuming realm after realm, until at last we too were forced to flee. The trees may shelter us for a time, but they cannot stand forever against the fire and iron of the enemy. Better to make our stand while yet we have allies and hope remains than to wait until we face the darkness alone. As dawn broke grey and cheerless through the leaves, Orifer made his decision. Swift messengers were sent through the woodland paths, bearing word to all the scattered folk of the forest that the time of hiding was ended. From every dell and hidden grove they came, the wood elves with their bows of yew and their swords of elven steel, ready to follow their king into whatever darkness lay ahead. And in the south, the hill that would one day be known as Dol Guldur grew ever taller, and from its depths came the sound of forging, as though some great work of malice was taking shape in the darkness below. Through the passes of the misty mountains, there came a rider in the grey hours before dawn, when mist clung to the valleys and the peaks stood like the ghosts of ancient kings against the dying stars. His horse was swift and sure of foot, despite the treacherous paths, and its eyes gleamed with a light that was not wholly of this world. But it was the rider himself who would have drawn the gaze of any who looked upon him, for though his form seemed that of an old man bent with years, There was about him an air of power that spoke of depths unmeasured and wisdom earned through ages of watching. This was Mithrandir, whom some called Gandalf the Grey, and he was one of the Astari, the wizards sent from the west to guide and counsel the free peoples in their struggle against the shadow. Long had he wandered the roads of Middle-earth, appearing now as a teller of tales to delight hobbit children, now as a counselor to kings, but always watching, always learning, always ready to stand against the darkness when the need was great. Now urgency drove him through the mountain passes, for word had come to him in dreams and visions of a malice stirring that had not been felt since the dark years when Morgoth troubled the world. In Lorien, he had spoken with Galadriel, she who bore Nenya the White, and whose sight pierced deeper than most into the patterns of the future. Her words had been few, but heavy with foreboding. "The shadow stirs, Mithrandir," she had said, as they walked beside the silver streams of Nimrodel. "In the south, a fortress rises that shall bring sorrow to many hearts. Already the trees begin to sicken where its shadow falls, and ere long the darkness will spread until even these fair woods know fear. Gil-galad must be warned, for the time comes when all who love the light must stand together or fall alone into the night that knows no dawn." Through Khazad-dûm he had ridden, where Durin's folk delved ever deeper into the roots of the mountain, seeking the precious mithril that gleamed like captured starlight in the darkness below. There Dain Ironfoot had received him with honor, though the dwarf lord's face grew grim when he heard the wizard's tidings. "Dark days are coming, Gandalf," Dain had said, his voice echoing in the great halls beneath the mountain. "Our miners speak of strange sounds in the deep places, as though something vast stirs far below even our deepest shafts. And there are whispers among my people of shadow shapes seen in the tunnels where no dwarf should walk alone." But it was as he descended from the western slopes of the mountains that Gandalf felt most keenly the weight of the growing darkness. The very air seemed thick with malice, and his horse shied often at shadows that held no form his eyes could see. More than once he was forced to kindle his staff with its inner light, driving back shapes that prowled at the edge of vision, neither wholly of the world nor entirely spirit, but partaking of both in ways that spoke of corruption beyond the natural order. At last, he came to the borders of Eregion, that realm which had once been fair beyond most places in Middle-earth, where the craftsmen of Ost in Edhill had wrought their works of wonder. But now he found it changed, the halls empty and the forges cold. Grass grew in the streets where once the hammers of the Myrdain had rung with ceaseless toil, and ivy covered the walls where master-smiths had once hung their finest works for all to see and wonder. In the ruins of Celebrimbor's house, he paused, feeling the weight of old sorrow heavy upon his heart. Here had been wrought both glory and ruin, beauty and betrayal intertwined like gold and poison in a single cup. The very stones seemed to whisper of regret, and in the empty halls he heard echoes of the ring song, that melody of power and binding that had sealed the fate of the Second Age. It was there, among the broken stones and fallen towers, that Gandalf met with one who had been waiting for his coming. Elrond, half elven, stood in what had once been Celebrimbor's forge, his dark hair stirring in a wind that touched nothing else, his grey eyes fixed upon the ruined anvil where so much of hope and sorrow had been shaped. "I knew you would come this way," said Elrond, his voice carrying the sadness of ages. "For you too feel the stirring in the south, and you know as I do that the darkness which we thought banished forever begins to wake once more." "Aye," replied Gandalf, leaning heavily upon his staff. "The necromancer stirs in his fastness, though few yet understand what manner of power has taken root in Dol Guldur. Gil-galad must be warned, and the White Council must be summoned, for I fear we face a peril greater than any since the Black Breath swept down from Angband in the elder days." Together they stood in that place of memory and loss, two guardians of Middle-earth, contemplating the shadows that gathered on every horizon. The wind moved through the ruins with a sound like weeping, and in its voice they heard the lament of all fair things that had passed away, and the fear of all that yet might be lost if the darkness should triumph. "Come," said Elrond at last, "let us ride to Lindon with all speed, for Gil-galad the wise must hear these tidings ere the night grows deeper. And perhaps in the halls of the High King we may find counsel to guide us through the trials that lie ahead." So they departed from Eregion, leaving behind them the empty halls where once such bright hopes had flourished and failed. Behind them, the ruins settled deeper into silence, while ahead the road stretched long and dark toward the sea, and the burden of their knowledge lay heavy upon their hearts like stones cast into deep water, sending ripples of consequence into an uncertain future. The messenger came to Lindon at the turning of autumn, when the malon trees stood gold against the grey sky, and the sea winds carried the scent of salt and the promise of winter storms. He was one of the Galadhrim, tall and fair even among the Eldar, but his face was marked with the shadow of great haste and greater fear. Before the throne of Gil-galad, he bent his knee, but his eyes were wide with the memory of what he had seen. "High King," said he, his voice carrying the musical accent of Lothlorien, "I bear tidings from the Lady Galadriel, she who keeps the mirror and watches over the borders of the Golden Wood. Dark news I bring, and darker still the portents that accompany it." Gil-galad leaned forward upon his throne, the lamplight gleaming upon the silver circlet that bound his dark hair. Around him stood the lords of Lindon, and among them Elrond and Círdan, the shipwright, their faces grave with the prescience of coming sorrow. In the air hung the tension that comes before great storms, when even the seabirds grow silent and the waves seem to whisper of upheaval in the deep places of the world. "Speak then," commanded the king, "and let no fear stay your tongue, for we who have looked upon the light of Valinor are not easily daunted by shadows, however dark they may appear." The messenger drew breath and spoke. "My lord, in the south there rises now a hill that was not there when the world was young. High it stands above the vales of Anduin, dark and terrible, crowned with a tower of black stone that seems to drink the very light from the sky. No grass grows upon its slopes, no bird nests in the crags that ring it round, and the river itself turns aside as though it would not flow beneath that shadow. But this is not the worst, O king, for from that tower there comes by night a malice that can be felt across all the leagues that lie between. The Lady Galadriel has looked into her mirror and seen visions that filled even her wise heart with dread. She bids me tell you that the necromancer has come indeed to dwell in Dol Guldur, and his power grows with each passing day. Already, the woods begin to sicken where his shadow falls, and creatures of malice multiply in the darkness beneath the trees. A silence fell upon the hall, broken only by the distant sound of waves upon the shore and the whisper of wind through the high windows. Gil-galad rose from his throne and walked to the great casement that looked eastward, though no light of tower or hill could be seen from that place across the leagues of Middle-earth. Yet all felt that his gaze pierced far beyond the limits of mortal sight, seeking some glimpse of the threat that had taken root in the heart of the world. "Long have I feared this day would come," said the king at last, his voice heavy with the weight of foreknowledge. "In the deeps of time I have seen the shadow that would one day rise again, though I hoped against hope that the years might prove my vision false. Tell me, messenger of Lothlorien, what more does the lady see in her mirror? What shape does this necromancer take, and what manner of servants gather to his banner?" "My lord," replied the Galadrim, "she sees shapes in the darkness that have no form she can name, save that they partake both of shadow and flesh, of spirit and matter, in ways that violate the order of creation. Sorcerers come to serve him, and creatures bred in the deep places where no light has ever shone. But most terrible of all, she sees the Nine, the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, who were once kings among men, but are now servants of the darkness, neither living nor dead, bound by rings of power to do the will of their master." At these words, a shudder ran through the assembly, for the tale of the Nine was known to all, though few spoke of it save in whispers. They had been great lords once, wise and mighty in their own realms, but the rings they bore had betrayed them, and slowly they had faded from the light until only their malice remained, clothed in shadow and terror. Elrond stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "If the Nine ride forth from Dol Guldur, then no realm of Middle-earth is safe from their malice. They can pass where armies cannot go, and their very presence brings despair to the hearts of the living. Already I have heard rumors from the southern lands of riders in black who appear at crossroads by night, seeking always, searching always, for something they have lost but cannot name." "Aye," said Tírdan, his ancient voice like the sound of waves on shingle, "and the ships that come to my havens from the southern ports bring tales of darkness spreading. Captains speak of storms that rise from cloudless skies, and of great seabirds that fall dead from the air for no cause that mortal eyes can see. The very water seems to flee from certain shores, and the tide pools lie empty where once they teemed with life." Gil-galad turned from the window and faced his assembled lords, and in his eyes burned a light that had not dimmed since the day he first looked upon the two trees in the blessed realm. "Then the time of watching is ended," said he, "and the hour of action is at hand. Send word to all our allies, from the halls of Khazad-dûm to the borders of Fangorn, from the havens of Mithlond to the hidden valley of Rivendell. Let all who love the light and would preserve it from corruption make ready for war, for I perceive that this necromancer is no lesser evil, but the very shadow we have long dreaded to see return." "My lord," said Elrond, "do you then believe that Sauron himself has taken form again and dwells now in Dol Guldur?" The king was silent for a long moment, his gaze turned inward as though consulting memories that stretched back to the dawn of the world. When at last he spoke, his words fell like the tolling of a great bell, marking the end of one age and the beginning of another. "I believe that the hour has come when all the malice of the world shall be gathered into one purpose, and that purpose is the dominion of all life under shadow. Whether this necromancer be Sauron returned or some other power of darkness matters less than this. He must be thrown down ere his strength grows beyond our power to challenge. The alliance that cast down the Dark Tower in the days of Isildur must rise again, or all shall be lost in night eternal. Thus was the doom of the Second Age sealed, though none then living could foresee the long road of sorrow that lay ahead, nor guess that in the end victory would come not through the might of kings or the wisdom of the wise, but through the courage of the small and humble, walking into darkness with no light but hope to guide their steps. 3 days after the messenger's coming, Gil-galad held council with his wisest advisors in the high chamber of the Tower of the Sea, where the great lamp burned eternal and the walls were carved with the history of the Eldar from the awakening at Cuivianen to the founding of the Grey Havens. Present were Elrond, herald of the king, Círdan, the shipwright, whose beard was white with the foam of countless tides, and Galdor of the Mithlond, keeper of the Grey Havens' defences. But it was to Mithrandir that all eyes turned, for he alone among them had walked in the shadow of Dol Guldur and felt the weight of its malice. "Tell us, Mithrandir," said Gil-galad, "what your eyes have seen of this fastness that troubles the peace of the world. For though our messenger brought dark tidings from Lothlorien, I would hear from one who has looked upon the very walls of this place and felt the breath of its evil." Gandalf leaned heavily upon his staff, and for a moment his form seemed to flicker in the lamplight, as though the memory of what he had witnessed threatened to overwhelm even his great strength. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of one who has looked into the abyss and felt it gaze back with malice beyond mortal comprehension. "I have stood upon the borders of that realm of shadow," said he, "and I tell you truly that Dol Guldur is no mere fortress raised by earthly hands. The very hill upon which it stands has been twisted by dark sorcery, shaped not by wind and water over the long ages, but by will and malice in the span of a few short years. The stones of its walls weep with a moisture that is not dew, and the air around it shimmers with heat that comes not from any wholesome fire." He paused, gathering his strength, and all who listened felt the chill that comes when evil is spoken of in the hearing of the wise. Outside the windows, the sea winds sighed among the towers of Lindon, but even their clean salt breath could not entirely dispel the shadow that seemed to gather in the chamber as the wizard's tale unfolded. "I went there in the guise of a wanderer," Gandalf continued, "seeking knowledge of what manner of power had taken root in that place. But ere I could draw near to the tower's base, I felt the weight of watching eyes upon me, and knew that my presence was marked by intelligences that dwelt in darkness. The very ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and the shadows moved with purpose, reaching out like grasping fingers to ensnare any who walked unwary in that accursed place." "What did you see within the tower itself?" asked Elrond, though his voice suggested he feared the answer. "Nothing," replied Gandalf, and the word fell into the chamber like a stone cast into a deep well. And that nothingness was more terrible than any sight of horror could have been. For where there should have been windows, there was only void, and where there should have been movement, there was only the suggestion of vast shapes stirring in the depths. Yet from that emptiness came a presence that pressed upon the mind like the weight of mountains, seeking always to crush the will and bend the heart to despair. Círdan stroked his long beard, his eyes distant with memory. "I have felt such a presence before," said he quietly, "in the days when the Dark Lord walked openly in Mordor and his armies swept across the plains of Dagorlad. This is no lesser evil that has taken root in Dol Guldur, but the very malice we thought banished from the world forever." "Then Sauron has indeed returned," said Gil-galad, though his voice held no surprise, only the weariness of one who has long expected evil tidings. "The question that remains is this: what form has his malice taken? And how shall we answer the challenge that grows with each passing day?" It was then that Elrond spoke, his voice carrying the authority of one who had stood in the presence of the Valar and learned wisdom in the halls of Eärendil. "My lord, I believe we must gather the White Council ere the shadow spreads beyond our power to contain. For though Gil-galad, the High King, may command the allegiance of all free peoples in war, there are aspects of this darkness that require the wisdom of those who understand the deep magics and the nature of the rings of power." "The White Council," mused Gil-galad. "Aye, let it be so. Send word to Saruman the White, chief of our order, and to Radagast the Brown, who watches over the borders of the wild. Let Galadriel come forth from Lothlorien, if she will, bringing with her the wisdom of the elder days and the sight that pierces the veils of time. And you, Mithrandir, shall be among our number, for your knowledge of the enemy's ways may prove the key to our salvation or our doom." Thus was the White Council summoned for the first time, though none then present could foresee that it would meet again and again through the long years that followed, debating always how best to answer the growing threat of the shadow, until at last the fate of Middle-earth would hang upon decisions made in haste and wisdom stretched to the breaking point. As the council broke and the lords departed to their various tasks, Gil-galad remained alone in the high chamber, gazing eastward through the great window toward lands he could not see but knew were already falling under shadow. In his heart stirred memories of the day when he had first taken up the crown of the High Kings, young and full of hope that the peace won at such great cost would endure through all the ages of the world. Now he felt the weight of years upon him, and the certainty that ere long he would be called upon to draw sword again in the cause of light against darkness. But what grieved him most was not the prospect of war, for he had been born to that burden, but the knowledge that this time the victory might not be complete, and the shadow might return again and again, until at last even the light of the Eldar failed, and darkness covered all the world. Yet while light endures, he whispered to the wind, "We shall not yield, though all the fires of heaven be quenched, and the last star fall into night." And in Dol Guldur, something vast and malevolent stirred, as though it had heard his words across all the leagues that lay between, and found in them not threat, but promise of the sweet despair that would come when hope at last failed and the long night began. Deep in the foundations of Dol Guldur, where the twisted roots of the hill had been carved into chambers that no wholesome light had ever touched, there hung a figure in chains of black iron that seemed to drink the very warmth from the air around them. Once he had been a king among the Eldar, fair and wise, with a voice that could calm the wildest storm and eyes that held the light of stars. Now his golden hair hung lank with the moisture that wept eternally from the walls of his prison, and his form was bent with long torment. This was Thrain, son of Thror, who had been king under the mountain before Smaug the Golden came with fire and death to claim the lonely mountain for his own. Long years had passed since the dragon's coming, and longer still since Thrain had taken the last of the 7 rings and departed from the halls of his fathers, seeking some means to reclaim his lost kingdom. But the road had led him not to victory, but to this place of shadows, where the necromancer's servants had found him wandering mad with grief and the corruption of the ring he bore. Above him, footsteps echoed on the stone stairs that wound upward into the tower's height, and Thrain lifted his head with the slow care of one who has learned that hope is often the cruelest of all torments. But it was not one of his usual tormentors who descended into the darkness. Instead, there came a figure clad in grey robes, leaning upon a staff that flickered with its own inner light. The prisoner's eyes widened, for though his mind had been clouded by long suffering, he recognized the face of one who had been friend to his people in happier days. "Mithrandir," whispered Thrain, his voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "Is it truly you, or do the shadows play new tricks upon my failing sight?" Gandalf approached the hanging figure with sorrow heavy upon his heart, for he saw how the years of captivity had ravaged one who had once stood proud among the great lords of Middle-earth. The wizard's light drove back the worst of the darkness, and in its glow, the true extent of Thrain's suffering became clear. His wrists and ankles were raw from the iron that bound them, and his face was marked with lines of pain that spoke of torments beyond the merely physical. "It is I, old friend," said Gandalf softly, his voice carrying all the gentleness he could muster. "Though I come too late to spare you this anguish, I am here now, and perhaps together we may find a way to break these bonds that hold you." But Thrain shook his head, a terrible wisdom in his sunken eyes. "Nay, Grey Pilgrim, these chains are not wrought of iron alone, but of malice and the binding power of the ring I bore. Even should you strike them from my limbs, I fear I would not have strength to flee this place, for the necromancer's will lies heavy upon me, and each day I feel my own fading like a candle guttering in a bitter wind." "Tell me," said Gandalf, setting his staff against the wall so that its light might better illuminate the chamber, "how came you to this place? For when last I saw you, you were departing from the halls of your fathers with high hope in your heart and the strength of your people at your back." A shudder ran through Thrain's frame, and for a moment his eyes grew wild with the memory of horrors that words could scarcely encompass. "I followed the road that leads from Erebor toward the south and east," said he, his voice growing stronger as the tale unfolded, as though in the telling he found some small measure of relief from his torment. "Many leagues I travelled, through lands fair and foul, seeking always some sign or portent that might guide me to the reclaiming of my lost kingdom. But the ring I bore grew ever heavier upon my hand, and with each passing day it whispered to me of power and glory, of revenge upon the dragon and dominion over all the treasures of the earth. At first, I thought these were my own thoughts, born of just anger and righteous desire to reclaim what was mine by right. But slowly I came to understand that the voice I heard was not my own, but that of another, speaking through the gold that bound my finger. "The ring," murmured Gandalf, and in his voice was the weight of understanding, for he knew well the treachery of the Seven and the Nine, and how they had been made to serve the will of their secret master. It called to its maker, did it not? Drew you ever eastward, toward the place where its true master waited? "Aye," said Thrain, tears now flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. "Like a fish drawn by the angler's line, I was pulled ever toward this place of shadow, though I fought against the compulsion with all the strength that remained to me. But in the end, the ring's power proved the stronger, and I found myself at the gates of Dol Guldur with no memory of how I had come there, only the certainty that I had been summoned by a will that would not be denied." The Dwarf King's voice dropped to a whisper, and Gandalf was forced to lean close to catch his words. He was waiting for me, the necromancer, though he wore no form that mortal eyes could see clearly. A shadow he seemed, vast and terrible, with eyes like burning coals that looked into my very soul and found there all the darkness that dwells in the heart of every living thing. The ring upon my finger grew hot as molten metal, and I knew that I was undone, for it was his, and I but a thief who had thought to claim what was never mine to hold. "What did he seek from you?" asked Gandalf, though he feared the answer. "Knowledge," replied Thrain. "Knowledge of the doors of Erebor and the secret ways into the mountain. Knowledge of my son Thorin and where he might be found. But most of all, he sought knowledge of the ring itself, for though he had made it long ago in the fires of Mount Doom, much of its history had been hidden from him by the wisdom of those who guarded the Seven." A cold dread settled upon Gandalf's heart, for he began to see the shape of the necromancer's design, and it filled him with a fear greater than any he had known since the dark days when Morgoth troubled the world. "Did you tell him what he wished to know?" Thrain's face contorted with anguish, and his voice became the wail of the damned. "I held out as long as strength remained to me, Mithrandir, but the torments he devised were beyond the endurance of any mortal frame, and more terrible than any physical pain was the despair he poured into my mind, showing me visions of my people scattered and hopeless, of Erebor lying empty forever, of my son dying forgotten in some foreign land. In the end, my will broke like a reed before the storm, and I told him all he wished to know." Silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of water dripping in the darkness and the soft whisper of the wizard's robes as he moved closer to the chained king. With infinite gentleness, Gandalf reached out and touched Thrain's brow, and for a moment the light of his staff flared brighter, driving back the shadows that pressed close around them. "Peace, old friend," said the wizard softly. "You have borne a burden too great for any one person to carry, and there is no shame in yielding when the alternative was madness or death. What matters now is that you have survived to bring warning of the enemy's designs, and perhaps in that warning lies the seed of his ultimate defeat." But even as he spoke these words of comfort, Gandalf's heart was heavy with the knowledge of what Thrain's capture might mean for the future of Middle-earth. For if the necromancer now knew the secret ways into Erebor, and if he had indeed reclaimed one of the Seven Rings, then his power had grown beyond what any had dared to imagine, and the time of reckoning drew near like a storm gathering on the horizon of the world, in the deepest chamber of Dol Guldur, where the very stones seemed to weep with malice and the air hung thick with the stench of corruption. There stood a throne wrought of black iron and set with gems that held no light, but rather drew illumination into themselves like hungry mouths. Upon this seat of power sat a figure that was both there and not there, taking shape only when shadow fell upon shadow in such a way that the eye could almost perceive a form. This was the necromancer, he who had once been fair among the Maiar, serving in the halls of Aule the smith before pride and the lust for dominion had turned his heart to darkness. Now he was Sauron the deceiver, though few yet dared to speak that name aloud, and his form was wreathed in shadow so dense that it seemed to devour the very concept of light. Before him knelt one of his servants, a creature that had once been a man of Numenor in the days of that island's glory, but was now something far removed from the kindly race of mortals. Tall he stood, clad in robes of midnight blue, and his face was pale as bone beneath a hood that cast no shadow. This was the mouth of Sauron, chief among the Nazgûl, and his voice, when he spoke, was like the whisper of wind through graveyards. "Master," said he, his words carrying the chill of the tomb, "the Dwarf King has told us all we wish to know. The secret ways into Erebor lie open to our knowledge, and the Shah disposition of his people is revealed. Shall we move now to claim the mountain and its treasures?" The shadow upon the throne stirred, and when it spoke, its voice was like the rumble of distant thunder, pregnant with menace and the promise of storms to come. "Not yet, my servant. The dragon still holds the mountain, and Smaug the Mighty serves our purposes well in his greed and isolation. Let him guard the approaches to Erebor for a while longer, until the time comes when his fire may be turned to our advantage." "And what of the rings, master?" The dwarf bore one of the 7, and through it we have gleaned much knowledge of the others. 6 remain in the hands of the dwarf lords, and their power might be turned to serve the one. A sound emerged from the darkness that might have been laughter, but held no mirth, only the cruel satisfaction of one who sees his enemies walking unknowing into a trap of his own devising. The dwarves will resist, as is their nature, but in time even their stubborn hearts will bend to my will. For now, let them delve ever deeper into the roots of their mountains, seeking the treasures that glitter in the dark. They know not that they mine their own graves, and that the deeper they go, the closer they come to powers that have slept since the breaking of the world. The Nazgûl bowed lower, his form seeming to waver like smoke in a breeze. "What then are your commands, O Master? The strength of our armies grows daily, and the orcs breed swiftly in the pits beneath the tower. Soon we shall have might enough to challenge even the hosts of Gil-galad." "Patience," hissed the voice from the throne, and in that single word was contained all the malice of ages uncounted. The High King is wise beyond most of his kindred, and the light of Valinor burns yet in his eyes. To move against him before our strength is complete would be folly, and I have learned the price of such haste in ages past. No, we shall wait and watch, gathering our forces while the enemy grows complacent in his distant halls. The shadow leaned forward slightly, and the air in the chamber grew colder still, as though winter itself emanated from that dread presence. But there are other ways to wage war than with sword and flame. Send forth the 9 upon their dark errands. Let them ride the roads of Middle-earth by night, seeking always, searching always, for the thing that was lost, and let fear go before them like a herald so that the hearts of men may know despair, even before they see the face of their doom. It shall be as you command, Master. But what is it that the nine should seek? What was lost that must be found? For a moment, silence filled the chamber, a quiet so profound that it seemed to press against the very walls of reality. Then the necromancer spoke again, and his words carried the weight of destiny itself. Long ago, when first I forged the rings of power, I made the one ring to be master of all others, pouring into it my malice and my will to rule. But when the alliance of elves and men cast down my tower and took the ring from my hand, it was thought destroyed. Yet I know it was not, for I would have felt its unmaking like the tearing of my own flesh. Somewhere in Middle-earth it lies hidden, waiting for the hand that first gave it shape and purpose. The Nazgul's head rose slightly, and in the depths of his hood, 2 points of light gleamed like stars seen through fog. But Master, if the ring endures, why do you not simply call it to you? Did you not make it to answer your will above all others? Because my faithful servant, it was taken from me by one whose will proved stronger than mine own in that moment of our contest. The ring bears now the imprint of that struggle, and until I regain my full strength, it may resist my call. But when the hour comes that I stand again in my ancient might, then shall it come to me like a hound to its master's whistle, and all the world shall tremble at our reunion. The Dark Lord rose from his throne, and as he did so, his form seemed to expand and darken until he filled the chamber like a thundercloud pregnant with lightning. Go now and carry out my commands. Let the nine ride forth on their endless quest, and let the armies of darkness multiply in every deep place of the world. The time of hiding draws to its close, and soon the name of Sauron shall once again be spoken in whispers of terror from the halls of Lindon to the borders of Harad. The Nazgul bowed once more and departed, his footsteps making no sound upon the stone floor, but leaving behind them a coldness that lingered long after he had passed from sight. Alone in his chamber, the necromancer turned his attention to the great orb of black crystal that stood upon a pedestal beside his throne. Within its depths, images swirled like smoke, showing him visions of distant lands and the movements of his enemies. He saw Gil-galad in his high hall, reading dispatches that spoke of darkness spreading across the world. He saw Elrond in Rivendell, poring over ancient lore in search of wisdom to guide the coming struggle. He saw Galadriel in Lothlorien, gazing into her mirror with eyes that held both sorrow and determination. And he saw something else, something that brought a smile of cruel satisfaction to his shadowed features. In the halls of Khazad-dûm, he saw the dwarves delving ever deeper, their picks and hammers ringing against stone as they sought the veins of mithril that ran like silver fire through the roots of the mountain. But in the deepest places, where no dwarf had yet ventured, something stirred that had slept since the world was young. The Balrog of Morgoth, the shadow of flame, began to wake at last from its long slumber, roused by the sound of hammers and the scent of living breath in the deep places. Yes, whispered Sauron, his voice like the hiss of serpents in the dark. Let them dig and let them delve until they uncover that which should have remained forever buried. For when the flame of Udun walks again beneath the mountain, then shall Khazad-dûm fall, and the greatest fortress of the dwarves shall become a monument to their folly. The vision in the orb shifted, showing him other scenes of coming woe. In Greenwood the Great, the trees began to wither where his shadow fell strongest, and the elves of Orifer drew back toward the north and west, abandoning the southern glades to the darkness that crept ever closer to their halls. In Numenor, that blessed isle far across the western sea, he saw signs of the corruption that he himself had planted in the hearts of men, growing like a canker until it would one day consume that realm from within. "All proceeds according to my design," he murmured, his gaze turning at last toward the west, where beyond the circles of the world lay the undying lands from which he had been banished long ago. "The Valar think themselves safe in their blessed realm, but they shall learn that no distance is too great, no barrier too strong, to shield them from my vengeance. When Middle-earth lies in ruins and all hope is extinguished, then shall I turn my eyes toward the west, and even the light of Valinor shall dim before the shadow of my coming." Thunder rolled across the sky above Dol Guldur, though no natural storm had brought it, and in its echoes could be heard the laughter of the necromancer, terrible and mad with the certainty of eventual victory. In the cells below, Thrawn heard that sound and wept, knowing that his tormentor's power had grown beyond all hope of mortal resistance, and across all the lands of Middle-earth, sensitive souls felt a chill pass over them, as though a great shadow had fallen across the sun, and children woke crying from dreams they could not remember but would never entirely forget. The summons came to Gandalf in the grey hour before dawn, as he sat in meditation upon the borders of Dol Guldur, his staff planted in the earth before him, and his eyes fixed upon the dark tower that rose like a wound against the sky. 3 days he had lingered in that place of shadow, seeking some way to pierce the veils of malice that shrouded the necromancer's stronghold. But each attempt had been turned aside by powers that seemed to anticipate his every move. Now, as the first pale light of morning touched the eastern hills, he felt a presence stirring within the tower, ancient and terrible, and he knew that his time of waiting was at an end. The very air around him seemed to thicken with malevolence, and the grass beneath his feet withered and turned black, as though the earth itself recoiled from what was about to unfold. "So," murmured Gandalf, rising slowly to his feet and taking up his staff, "you would face me at last, Sauron the Deceiver. Let us see then which of us has learned the greater wisdom in the long years since last we met in council before the throne of Manwë." As if summoned by his words, a great wind arose from the direction of the tower, but it brought with it no freshness or relief from the oppressive heat that seemed to radiate from the cursed hill. Instead, it carried the stench of corruption and the whisper of voices that spoke words in the black speech, the tongue that Sauron had devised for his servants in the days of his first dominion. The trees around the wizard bent away from that wind as though they would flee if they could tear their roots from the soil. Then came the voice of the necromancer himself, speaking not through throat and tongue, but directly into Gandalf's mind, each word a violation of the natural order that made the wizard's very soul recoil in disgust. "Mithrandir the Grey, you who were called Olorin in the Blessed Realm, why do you linger at the borders of my domain? Have you come at last to bow before me and acknowledge the futility of your long resistance?" "I have come," replied Gandalf aloud, his voice ringing clear in the poisoned air, "to see with my own eyes what manner of corruption has taken root in this place, and to bear witness to the malice that spreads like a plague across the fair lands of Middle-earth. But bow I shall not, neither to you nor to any servant of the shadow, for I am Gandalf the Grey, and I serve the light alone." Laughter echoed from the tower, cold and mirthless, like the sound of breaking glass in a frozen wasteland. "The light, you say? And what light is that, O wizard?" "The light of the Valar, who sit in their protected realm and turn their faces from the sufferings of Middle-earth. The light of Gil-galad, who dreams of glory while his people dwindle and fade. The light of men who squabble among themselves while greater powers shape their destiny. Tell me, O Lorien, where is this light when darkness gathers and hope fails?" "The light endures," said Gandalf firmly, though he felt the weight of the necromancer's malice pressing against his mind like a tide of darkness seeking to drown his thoughts. "It endures in every act of courage, in every moment of compassion, in every choice to stand against despair, though all seems lost. You have forgotten this, Sauron, in your hunger for dominion, but I have not, and I never shall." "Brave words," came the mocking reply, "but what are words against the reality of power? Behold, and see how your precious light fares against the darkness I command." The air around Gandalf suddenly erupted into flame, but these were not the clean fires of hearth and forge, but the corrupt flames of Udun, shot through with veins of sickly green and purple that hurt the eye to look upon. They coiled around the wizard like serpents, seeking to burn not merely his flesh, but his very spirit, to reduce him to ash and shadow in service to their master's will. But Gandalf raised his staff, and from its crystal head blazed forth a light that was pure and white and clean, the light of Arundil's star distilled into visible form. Where that radiance touched the corrupt flames, they recoiled with hisses, like the sound of water poured upon hot coals, and the very air seemed to sigh with relief, as though freed from some terrible burden. "Your fire has no power over me," declared Gandalf, his voice growing stronger as his own light drove back the shadows that pressed around him. "For I bear the flame imperishable, kindled before the making of the world in the thought of Eru Ilúvatar himself. Against that light, all lesser fires must fail." The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, and from the depths of the hill came a rumbling like the sound of great millstones grinding, as though the very foundations of Dol Guldur were being shaken by the force of the conflict above. Trees that had stood for centuries crashed to the earth, their roots torn from soil that suddenly boiled with unnatural heat, and the sky above darkened as clouds gathered with impossible speed, shot through with lightning that was blood red and filled with malice. "Impressive," admitted the voice of the necromancer, though now it carried an edge of genuine anger that had not been there before. "You have indeed grown in power since last we met, O Lorien, but you are still only one, while I command legions. Let us see how your flame fares against the full might of my servants." From every shadow and crevice around the base of the tower, shapes began to emerge that hurt the mind to look upon directly. Some had the semblance of men, but stretched and twisted until they resembled spiders more than any mortal race. Others crawled upon too many legs, their eyes glowing like coals in faces that had never known the touch of sunlight. And above them all flew things with wings of tattered leather, shrieking with voices that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. They rushed upon Gandalf from all sides, a tide of darkness and corruption that sought to overwhelm him through sheer numbers. But the wizard stood firm, his staff blazing like a star, and where his light fell, the creatures of shadow writhed and dissolved like mist before the morning sun. His voice rose in words of power, speaking names and truths that had been old when the world was young, and each syllable struck the servants of darkness like a physical blow. "By the light of Eärendil," he cried, sweeping his staff in a great arc that sent waves of radiance washing over his foes. "By the fire of the flame imperishable, by the music that shaped the world from void, I banish you to the darkness from whence you came." Many of the shadow creatures fled at these words, unable to bear the purity of the light that blazed from the wizard's staff, but others pressed forward, driven by their master's will to destroy this beacon of hope that dared to shine in the heart of their domain. The battle raged for what seemed like hours, though the sun did not move in the sky, as though time itself had been frozen by the magnitude of the conflict. At last, when Gandalf's strength was nearly spent, and the creatures of darkness pressed close around him, he raised his staff one final time and spoke a word that made the very air ring like a great bell. The light that blazed forth was so brilliant that for a moment it seemed as though a second sun had been kindled in the world, and every shadow for leagues around was driven back to its source. In that blazing radiance, the voice of the necromancer came one last time, filled now with a fury that shook the foundations of his tower. "This is not ended, Olorin. You have won this day, but there will be others, and my power grows while yours is spent in these futile gestures. When next we meet, it shall be I who stands triumphant while you burn in the fires of my wrath." The light faded, and Gandalf found himself alone upon the blasted heath that surrounded Dol Guldur, the tower still standing dark and terrible against the sky. But something had changed in the quality of its shadow, as though the malice that dwelt within had been forced to draw back, if only for a little while. The wizard leaned heavily upon his staff, exhausted by the effort of the battle, but in his eyes burned a flame of satisfaction. "I have seen your face, Sauron," he whispered to the wind, "and I know now what manner of enemy we face. The White Council must be told of this, and all the free peoples must be warned. For the time of the final contest draws near, and all must choose at last between the light and the darkness." With those words, he turned and walked away from that place of shadow, his footsteps leaving no mark upon the corrupted earth. Behind him, Dol Guldur brooded in malevolent silence, but its master's voice pursued him no more that day, for Sauron too had learned something from their encounter, and he knew that the Grey Wizard would be a foe to reckon with when the final battle came. In the high halls of Lindon, where the sea winds sang through windows carved with the history of the elder days, the White Council sat in solemn assembly for the first time since its founding. 7 there were in that gathering, though one chair stood empty, for Radagast the Brown had not answered the summons, being far away in the wild lands beyond the misty mountains, tending to beasts and growing things that had fled from the spreading shadow. At the head of the council sat Gil-galad, the High King, his crown of silver catching the light of the great lamp that burned eternal in the center of the chamber. To his right sat Elrond, half-elven, his dark eyes grave with the weight of knowledge gleaned from ancient lore, and to his left Círdan the shipwright, eldest of all who dwelt in Middle-earth save for Tom Bombadil in his distant realm. These three formed the core of elven wisdom in the Western lands. Across from them sat the Astari who had answered the call, Saruman the White, chief of their order, whose robes gleamed like new snow and whose voice carried the authority of one long accustomed to command. And beside him, Gandalf the Grey, travel-stained and weary from his recent confrontation with the powers of darkness, his staff resting across his knees like a sword half drawn from its sheath. But it was to the seventh member of the council that all eyes turned with the greatest reverence, for Galadriel had come forth from Lothlorien at the High King's summons, bringing with her the wisdom of the undying lands and the sight that could pierce the veils of time. Fair she was beyond the measure of mortal words, with hair like spun gold and eyes that held the light of the two trees, though that light was tempered now with sorrow for all the darkness that had come upon the world. "My lords and lady," began Gil-galad, his voice carrying easily through the great chamber, though he spoke no louder than common speech. "We are gathered here because the shadow that we have long feared to name has at last revealed itself. Mithrandir has looked upon the face of our enemy and felt the weight of his malice. Let him now speak of what he has seen, that we may take counsel together on how best to answer this threat." Gandalf rose slowly, feeling the eyes of the council upon him, and for a moment he seemed older than his years, bowed down by the knowledge of what he had witnessed in that place of shadow. When he spoke, his words fell like stones cast into still water, sending ripples of consequence through the assembled wisdom of the wise. "My lords," said he, "I have stood before the gates of Dol Guldur and felt the malice that dwells within. I have spoken with the necromancer himself, and I tell you now without doubt or reservation that he is indeed Sauron returned, though diminished from his former might. The tower that rises in the south is no mere fortress, but a focus of power, drawing to itself all the malice and corruption that festers in the dark places of the world." A silence fell upon the council, though this was no surprise to any present, for all had suspected as much. It was Saruman who broke the quiet, his voice measured and thoughtful as he considered the implications of Gandalf's words. "If Sauron indeed dwells in Dol Guldur," said he, "then we must ask ourselves why he chooses to remain there, in a place of relative weakness, rather than returning to Mordor, where his power would be greatest. What purpose does this deception serve, and what should our response be?" "As to his purposes," replied Gandalf, "I believe he seeks to rebuild his strength slowly and in secret, hoping to avoid the attention of the Valar, until he is ready to reveal himself openly. But there is more to it than that. From his fortress in the south, he can threaten the woodland realms and control the passes of the misty mountains. More importantly, he is perfectly placed to corrupt the rings of power that remain in Middle-earth." At these words, Galadriel leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with understanding. "You speak of the 7 and the 9, said she, her voice like the music of streams flowing over stones. "The 9 are already his, bound to his will through the corruption of their bearers. But the 7, some at least remain free, do they not? One at least has fallen into his hands," said Gandalf grimly. "I found Thrain, son of Thror, in the dungeons beneath Dol Guldur, driven mad by torment and the influence of the ring he bore. Through him, Sauron has learned much of the dwarf lords and their secret ways, and I fear that knowledge will be turned to evil purpose ere long." Elrond spoke then, his voice heavy with the sorrow of one who has seen too much of suffering and loss. "Then the corruption spreads even to the stalwart hearts of the dwarves. If the seven can be turned to serve the shadow, then no realm in Middle-earth is safe from infiltration and betrayal." "Not all are lost," said Círdan quietly, his ancient voice carrying the authority of one who had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms beyond count. 4 of the 7 were consumed by dragonfire in ages past, when their bearers grew too bold in their delving and woke things better left sleeping. Of the remaining 3, 1 lies in Sauron's hands, but 2 yet remain with the dwarf lords of Khazad-dûm and the Grey Mountains. "And what of the 3? Asked Gil-galad, though he looked directly at Galadriel as he spoke, for all knew that she was keeper of Nenya, mightiest of the rings that remained free from Sauron's touch. "The 3 remain hidden and undefiled," she replied, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the place where Nenya rested, though the ring itself was invisible to mortal sight. "Vilya rests with Elrond, Narya with Círdan, and Nenya with me. But their power is tied to the fate of the One, and should Sauron ever reclaim his Master Ring, then even the 3 would be subject to his will." At mention of the One Ring, all fell silent, for that was the shadow that lay deepest upon their councils. Lost it was, somewhere in the wide world, but while it endured, the threat of its discovery by the enemy hung over all their plans like a sword suspended by a thread. It was Saruman who spoke at last, his white robes rustling as he leaned forward in his chair. "The question before us is not whether Sauron has returned, for that is now beyond doubt, but what we should do with this knowledge. Do we move against him now, while his strength is still growing, or do we wait and watch, hoping to learn more of his designs? If we attack Dol Guldur directly," said Elrond thoughtfully, "we might drive him from that place, but we would also reveal the full extent of our knowledge and our concern. He might then abandon his strategy of secrecy and move openly against us before we are prepared. And if we wait," countered Gandalf, "his power will continue to grow, and each day of delay makes our eventual victory less certain. Already his influence spreads beyond the borders of his stronghold. The woods sicken where his shadow falls, and creatures of malice multiply in every dark corner of the world." Galadriel raised her hand, and all turned to hear her words, for her wisdom was deep beyond the measure of any in Middle-earth, save perhaps for Elrond himself. "There is truth in both counsels," said she, "but I think we must consider not only what Sauron does, but what he seeks. His greatest desire is for the recovery of the One Ring, for without it, his dominion can never be complete. If we can ensure that the ring remains hidden from him, then time itself becomes our ally." "But how can we guard against what we cannot find?" asked Círdan. "The ring was lost in the waters of Anduin when Isildur fell, and though many have searched, none have found trace of it in all the years since." "Perhaps," said Galadriel quietly, "it is better lost than found, if its discovery would mean only that it falls once more into the hands of the enemy. Some things are too dangerous to wield, even in the cause of good, and the Ring of Power is chief among such perilous tools." The debate continued through the long watches of the night, with wisdom pitted against wisdom, and each counselor offering their own vision of how best to guard against the growing shadow. But in the end, It was Gil-galad who spoke the words that would guide their actions in the days to come. "We shall watch and wait," said the High King at last, "but not in idleness. Let our spies and messengers range far and wide, gathering news of the enemy's movements and the state of all the free peoples. Let alliances be strengthened and old friendships renewed, so that when the time comes for open war, we shall not face the darkness alone. And above all, let us guard the secret of our knowledge, for while Sauron believes himself hidden, we retain the advantage of knowing his true nature and purpose." Thus ended the first great council of the wise in the face of the returned shadow, though none there present could foresee that it would be many years before they met again, and that when they did, the world would be changed beyond all recognition, and choices would be forced upon them that would test the very foundations of their wisdom and resolve. In the months that followed the council in Lindon, Gandalf took upon himself the burden of travelling far and wide through Middle-earth, seeking to gauge the temper of the free peoples and to prepare in subtle ways for the trials that lay ahead. His path led him first to the great halls of Khazad-dûm, where Dain Ironfoot ruled over the mightiest realm of the dwarves with wisdom tempered by the forge fire of long experience. The halls of the dwarf kingdom were vast beyond the imaging of those who dwelt beneath the sky, carved from the living rock with skill that rivaled the works of the Vala themselves. Pillars rose like great trees of stone, their capitals carved with runic inscriptions that told the history of Durin's folk from their awakening in the distant past to the present day. Through these halls echoed the sound of hammers upon anvils, for the dwarves were ever at their work, crafting things of beauty and utility that would endure long after their makers had passed beyond the circles of the world. But it was not beauty alone that drew Gandalf's attention as he walked the deep roads of Khazad-dûm. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs of the kingdom's growing wealth and power. Mithril flowed from the mines like silver water, more precious than gold and worked by the dwarf-smiths into mail and ornaments of surpassing fineness. Warriors stood guard at every gate and junction, their axes keen and their armor bright, ready to defend their realm against any threat that might emerge from the darkness beyond. Yet even in this place of strength and prosperity, Gandalf could sense the shadows gathering. The miners spoke in whispers of strange sounds that echoed from the deepest shafts, and more than one had reported glimpsing shapes that seemed to move in the darkness beyond the reach of their lamps. Most dismissed these tales as the products of overworked imaginations, but the wizard remembered the words of the necromancer, and his heart grew troubled. "You are welcome in Khazad-dûm, Gandalf Greyhaim," said Dain when the wizard was brought before the throne of the Dwarf King. "But I see in your eyes the weight of dark tidings. What news do you bring from the wide world above?" "News that I would speak of in private council," replied Gandalf, glancing meaningfully at the assembled courtiers who filled the great hall. "For some words are too heavy to be spoken before all ears, and some knowledge too dangerous to be spread without careful thought." Dain nodded, understanding the wizard's meaning, and dismissed his court with a gesture. When they were alone, save for the king's most trusted counselors, Gandalf spoke of what he had learned in Dol Guldur and of the growing threat that menaced all the free peoples of Middle-earth. "So," said Dain when the tale was finished, his weathered face grim with understanding, "the shadow returns once more to trouble the world. I had hoped that the peace won at such great cost in the War of the Last Alliance would endure for many ages yet, but it seems that hope was vain. Peace is precious, agreed Gandalf, but it can only be preserved by those who are willing to fight for it when the need arises. The question now is whether the dwarves of Khazad-dûm will stand with the other free peoples when the hour of testing comes. Ask rather whether the other free peoples will stand with us, replied Dain with a trace of the old dwarvish pride. We are the children of Aule the smith, and we do not flee from battle when our homes are threatened. If this necromancer thinks to challenge the might of Durin's folk, he will learn that dwarf axes bite deep and dwarf mail turns aside the sharpest blade. But even as he spoke these brave words, Dain's eyes were troubled, and Gandalf knew that the Dwarf King felt the same unease that had touched the Shah wizard's heart. For though the dwarves were mighty in war and their halls were strong, they faced a threat unlike any they had encountered before, one that could corrupt the very rings of power and turn their greatest strengths into weaknesses. From Khazad-dûm, Gandalf travelled north to the Grey Mountains, where the dwarves of that region had made their homes in halls carved from the living ice and stone. There he found Thorin Oakenshield, son of Thrain, living in exile with the remnant of his people, their hearts bitter with the memory of their lost kingdom beneath the lonely mountain. Thorin was a dwarf in the prime of his years, strong and proud, with the bearing of one born to rule. But his eyes held a shadow of sorrow, for he alone among his people knew the full extent of what had been lost when Smaug the Golden came with fire and death to claim Erebor for his own. In his heart burned a flame of longing for his ancestral home, and with it a determination to reclaim what had been taken, no matter the cost. Gandalf the Grey, said Thorin when the wizard appeared at the gates of his hall, you are welcome among the exiles of Erebor, though I fear we have little to offer you save the warmth of our hearth and the loyalty of hearts that have not forgotten their friends. It is not comfort I seek, replied Gandalf, but counsel and alliance in dark times. For the shadow stirs once more in the world, and all who would preserve the light must stand together or fall alone. In the long hours that followed, Gandalf spoke carefully of the threat that grew in Dol Guldur, though he did not reveal all that he knew of the necromancer's true identity or the fate of Thrain, for he sensed that Thorin's heart was already heavy with grief and anger, and he feared that the knowledge of his father's captivity might drive the young king to some rash action that would serve only the enemy's purpose. Instead, he spoke of the need for the scattered dwarf clans to unite, and of the importance of reclaiming the great strongholds that had fallen into ruin or enemy hands. Erebor stands empty save for the dragon, he said carefully, and while Smaug holds the mountain, that great fortress cannot serve as a bulwark against the darkness that gathers in the south. At mention of the dragon and the lost kingdom, Thorin's eyes blazed with an inner fire, and his hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword. Do you counsel me to attempt the reclaiming of Erebor? He asked, his voice tight with the effort of keeping his emotions in check. For if you do, know that I have thought of little else since the day we fled from in the spring that followed the harsh winter of Gandalf's northern wanderings. The wizard found himself drawn once more to the green hills and flowering meadows of the Shire, though he could not have said precisely what force compelled him to return to that peaceful land. Perhaps it was the memory of simpler times, when the world's troubles seemed distant and manageable. Or perhaps it was some deeper instinct that told him the hobbits would have a part to play in the great drama that was unfolding across Middle-earth. The road from the Grey Havens wound through countryside that seemed untouched by the shadows gathering in the eastern lands. Apple trees stood heavy with blossom, their petals drifting on the warm breeze like snow in summer, and the fields were green with new grass, where sheep grazed contentedly beneath the mild sun. In the gardens of the hobbit holes, flowers bloomed in riot of colour, tulips and daffodils, primroses and violets, tended by careful hands that found joy in the simple act of nurturing beauty. It was in this season of renewal that Gandalf came to the green door of Bag End, the finest hobbit hole in all Hobbiton, set into the hill with windows that looked out over the valley and gardens that were the envy of every hobbit in the district. The door was painted the same shade of green as new leaves, with a brass knocker polished to mirror brightness and a brass nameplate that read B. Baggins in letters of impeccable respectability. Behind that door dwelt Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit of middle years who had settled into the comfortable routine of a bachelor's life with all the satisfaction of one who has found his proper place in the world. His days were spent in the pleasant occupations of a well-to-do hobbit, tending his garden, writing in his journals, reading the books that lined his study walls, and enjoying meals that were the product of a well-stocked pantry and considerable culinary skill. Yet there was something about Bilbo that set him apart from his neighbours, though few could have put their finger on precisely what it was. Perhaps it was the way his eyes would sometimes grow distant, as though he were looking at horizons far beyond the borders of the Shire. Perhaps it was the questions he asked about the wide world and the peoples who dwelt beyond the Hobbit lands, questions that seemed odd coming from one who had never travelled farther than the neighbouring village of Bywater. Or perhaps it was simply that he was a Baggins of Bag End, heir to a line of hobbits who had always been counted respectable, but had never been entirely predictable. His mother had been a Took, and everyone knew that the Tooks were prone to unseemly adventures and alarming outbursts of curiosity about things that were none of their proper business. When Gandalf knocked upon the green door that bright morning, he was unsurprised to find Bilbo pottering about his garden with a watering can, humming softly to himself as he tended to the emerging shoots of what promised to be a spectacular display of flowers. The hobbit looked up at the sound of footsteps on the path, and his round face broke into a smile of genuine pleasure. "Gandalf," he exclaimed, setting down his watering can and wiping his hands on the leather apron he wore over his waistcoat. "What a delightful surprise. I was just thinking this morning that it had been far too long since you last graced Bag End with your presence. Come in, come in. I was about to put the kettle on for second breakfast, and there's fresh seed cake cooling on the kitchen windowsill." The wizard smiled, feeling some of the weight lift from his heart at the hobbit's warm welcome. "I thank you for your hospitality, my dear Bilbo," he said, ducking his head to pass through the doorway. "And I confess that the prospect of your seed cake is not the least of the attractions that drew me to your door." Inside, Bag End was everything a hobbit hole should be: comfortable, well-appointed, and redolent with the pleasant scents of beeswax polish, pipe tobacco, and whatever delightful meal was currently in preparation. The round windows let in golden light that danced over walls panelled in warm wood and floors covered with rugs woven in patterns of flowers and leaves. Books lined the shelves, maps hung framed upon the walls, and everywhere were the small touches that spoke of a life lived with care and attention to beauty. As they settled in the sitting room with tea and cake, Gandalf found himself studying his host with new eyes, seeing not just the comfortable hobbit he had known for years, but something more, a spirit that yearned for horizons beyond the familiar, a heart that beat with dreams of distant places and deeds of renown. It was a quality that most hobbits lacked, content as they were with their ordered lives and predictable pleasures. But in Bilbo, it burned like a small flame that only waited for the right wind to fan it into blazing fire. "Tell me," said Bilbo as he poured tea from a pot decorated with painted roses, "what news from the wide world? Your last visit was all too brief, and I have been hungry for tales of the lands beyond our borders. Have you been to Dale recently, or the Lonely Mountain? I have such curious dreams sometimes about that place, though I've never seen it save in the maps that hang in my study." "Dale lies in ruins still," replied Gandalf carefully, "and the Lonely Mountain sleeps beneath the coils of Smaug the Golden. But there are stirrings in the world, my dear Bilbo, changes that may affect even the peaceful Shire before all is said and done." The hobbit leaned forward in his chair, his eyes bright with the curiosity that marked him as different from his more stolid neighbours. "What manner of changes? Surely nothing too dreadful can touch us here, with the rangers watching our borders and the wide lands between us and whatever troubles may arise in the eastern realms." Gandalf sipped his tea thoughtfully, wondering how much to reveal to this eager audience. "The shadow stirs," he said at last, "and ancient enemies thought defeated show signs of renewed strength. There may come a time when all the free peoples must stand together, when courage will be needed in the most unlikely places and from the most unexpected folk." "You speak as though great deeds are afoot," said Bilbo wistfully. "The sort of adventures that the old songs tell of, when heroes walked the earth and dragons were more than children's tales. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to see such marvels with my own eyes, to walk roads that lead beyond the maps and look upon mountains that scrape the very sky." "Adventures," mused Gandalf, and there was something in his tone that made Bilbo set down his teacup and listen more carefully. "Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things that make you late for dinner, as I believe the saying goes in these parts. But sometimes, my dear hobbit, adventures choose us rather than we them. And when that happens, we must decide whether to answer the call or spend the rest of our lives wondering what we might have missed." They spoke long into the afternoon, wizard and hobbit, one who had walked the roads of Middle-earth for uncounted years and one who had never ventured beyond the borders of his beloved Shire. Yet in their conversation, Gandalf sensed the birth of possibilities that had not existed before, the stirring of forces that might one day prove crucial to the fate of the world. As the sun began to sink toward the western hills and the time came for parting, Gandalf paused at the green door and looked back at his host. "Tell me, Bilbo," he said quietly, "if adventure came knocking at your door, would you answer its call? If the wide world had need of a brave heart and a stout spirit, would you leave the comfort of Bag End to serve a cause greater than yourself?" Bilbo stood in his doorway, the setting sun casting long shadows across his garden, and for a moment, his comfortable respectability seemed to fall away like a discarded cloak. In its place stood something harder and brighter, a spirit that had been sleeping but was not dead, waiting only for the right moment to wake and answer the ancient call to adventure. "I think," he said slowly, his voice carrying a note of wonder as though he surprised himself with his words, "I think that I would. For all the comfort and security in the world cannot fill the emptiness that comes from knowing you never tested yourself against the unknown, never discovered what you might become if circumstances demanded more than you thought you had to give." Gandalf smiled, an expression of deep satisfaction crossing his weathered features. "Then perhaps," he said, shouldering his pack and taking up his staff, "adventure will find its way to Bag End sooner than you think. The world has a way of calling upon those it needs most, often when they least expect it." With those words, he set off down the path that led away from Hobbiton, leaving behind him a hobbit who stood in his doorway, watching until the wizard's grey form disappeared into the gathering dusk. And though Bilbo returned to his comfortable routine in the days that followed, something had changed in the ordered world of Bag End, a restlessness that spoke of destinies waiting to unfold and adventures that would test the courage of the most unlikely heroes. In his study that night, Bilbo stood before the great map that showed the lands beyond the Shire, his finger tracing the route that led eastward toward the Lonely Mountain. "Smaug the Golden," he whispered to himself, the name both frightening and fascinating on his tongue. "I wonder what it would be like to look upon a real dragon, to see with my own eyes the treasures that the old songs speak of." He did not know, as he stood there dreaming of distant places and impossible adventures, that his words were heard by more than the night wind that sighed through the eaves of Bag End. For fate has long ears and longer memory, and the wishes of the brave, however quietly spoken, have a way of echoing through the halls of time until they return transformed into destiny. The seasons turned with their ancient rhythm, and the year wheeled toward autumn once more. But this time, Gandalf's steps carried him not to the peaceful Shire, but to the wild lands north of the Misty Mountains, where Thorin Oakenshield had made his temporary hall among the ruins of an ancient watchtower. The place was windswept and austere, fitting perhaps for a king in exile, but lacking all the warmth and grandeur that had once graced the halls beneath the Lonely Mountain. Here, Thorin had gathered the remnant of his people, those dwarves who had fled from Erebor when Smaug came with fire and death, and those who had joined them in the years since, drawn by loyalty to the line of Durin and the hope that one day their king would lead them home. They were a hardy folk, these exiles, weathered by years of wandering and hardship, but their axes were sharp and their hearts burned with the same fierce pride that had made their ancestors the terror of orc and goblin in the deep places of the world. When Gandalf arrived at the gates of Thorin's stronghold, he found the Dwarf King in his forge, working at the bellows while his nephew, Dwalin, hammered red-hot steel into the shape of an axe head. The sound rang through the hall like a great bell, and in its rhythm was all the defiance of a people who had lost their home, but not their will to fight for its reclaiming. "Gandalf, Greyheim," said Thorin, looking up from his work, his face streaked with soot and sweat, but his eyes bright with the fire that burns in the heart of every true smith. You come at a fitting time, for I have been thinking much on the words we spoke when last you graced my hall. Tell me, wizard, do you still believe that the hour approaches when Erebor might be reclaimed? I believe, replied Gandalf carefully, that the time has come when bold action may serve where patient waiting has not. But such an undertaking would require more than courage alone. It would need careful planning, suitable companions, and perhaps most importantly, the element of surprise that comes from approaching the mountain by ways that Smaug does not expect. Thorin set down his hammer and turned to face the wizard fully, his blue eyes blazing with an intensity that spoke of years of dreaming and planning for this moment. You speak as though you have given this matter considerable thought. What scheme have you devised, and what part would you have me play in it? For answer, Gandalf drew from his robes a map, ancient and yellowed with age, its edges worn from much handling. Upon it were drawn the lands around the lonely mountain, but marked with paths and passages that few now living would recognize. For it had been made in the days when Erebor stood in its glory, and trade flowed freely between the mountain kingdom and the cities of men. This came to me from your father, said Gandalf quietly, watching as Thorin's face grew pale at the mention of Thrain. Before his final departure from these lands, he entrusted it to my keeping, saying that it might one day prove useful to his son and heir. The Dwarf King took the map with hands that trembled slightly, his eyes scanning the familiar landmarks and the secret ways that had been known only to the royal house of Durin. The hidden door, he whispered, his finger tracing a mark upon the map's eastern face. I had heard tales of it in my youth, but thought it might be legend only. If this is true, if such an entrance truly exists, then you might enter the mountain unseen, finished Gandalf, and perhaps find some way to deal with Smaug before he becomes aware of your presence. But such a plan would require more than the 13 dwarves who follow you here. You would need companions skilled in stealth and silence, folk who could move unseen through enemy territory and keep their counsel even under torture. What manner of companions do you have in mind? Asked Thorin, though something in the wizard's tone warned him that the answer might not be to his liking. I have been giving much thought to that question, replied Gandalf, and I believe the answer lies not with warriors or kings, but with one whose very ordinariness might prove his greatest asset. A burglar, you might say, one so small and quiet that he could slip past even a dragon's watchful eye. Thorin's expression darkened, and his hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword. You speak in riddles, wizard. What burglar could possibly aid in the reclaiming of Erebor? And what manner of treasure could tempt such a one to face the terror of Smaug the Golden? Not all treasures are gold and silver, said Gandalf mildly. Some folk are moved by the call of adventure, by the desire to test themselves against the unknown and discover what they might become when necessity strips away the comfort of familiar surroundings. I know of such a one, dwelling in peace not far from here, who might prove the very key to your mountain's liberation. A hobbit, said Thorin flatly, his voice carrying all the scorn that a warrior king might feel for such unheroic folk. You would have me trust the fate of my kingdom to a creature that has never ventured beyond its garden gate, that knows nothing of war or dragons or the great deeds that songs are made of. Perhaps, replied Gandalf, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been amusement. That very ignorance might prove an advantage. Smaug expects to face dwarf warriors bent on vengeance, or perhaps men seeking gold and glory. He does not expect a small, quiet creature whose greatest ambition is a well-cooked meal and a comfortable chair by the fire. Long they debated through the night, wizard and king, while the forge fire burned low and the wind moaned through the ruins of the watchtower. Thorin's pride rebelled against the idea of accepting help from such an unlikely source, but his desperation to reclaim his birthright was stronger than his prejudice, and slowly he began to see the wisdom in Gandalf's proposal. "Very well," he said at last, his voice heavy with reluctance but firm with resolve. "If you truly believe this hobbit might serve our cause, then I will trust your judgment, though it goes against all my instincts. But understand this, wizard. If we undertake this quest, it will be to victory or death. I will not retreat again, will not spend more years in exile dreaming of a home that remains forever beyond my reach." "Then let us make ready," said Gandalf, rising from his chair and shouldering his pack. "For the time has come to set great deeds in motion, and fate will not wait upon our convenience. Gather your most trusted companions, those whose loyalty has been tested by hardship and whose courage will not fail when the dragon's fire burns brightest. In 3 days' time, I will return with our 14th companion, and then we shall see whether the songs of future generations will tell of the reclaiming of Erebor or the glorious folly of Thorin Oakenshield." As the wizard departed into the grey light of dawn, Thorin stood watching from the gate of his stronghold, his mind already turning to the preparations that must be made. The map still lay spread upon the table in his hall, its ancient markings pointing toward a destiny that had been written in the stars long before his birth. Whether that destiny led to triumph or tragedy remained to be seen, but for the first time in many years, the exiled king felt the stirring of genuine hope in his heart. Behind him, his companions had begun to gather, drawn by some instinct that told them their long waiting was nearly at an end. Dwalin and Balin, brothers both and faithful beyond the bonds of blood. Fili and Kili, his sister sons, young and eager for glory. Oin and Gloin, Ori and Dori and Nori, Bifur and Bofur and Bombur, each a dwarf of proven worth, each ready to follow their king into whatever dangers lay ahead. "Tomorrow we begin the journey home," Thorin told them, his voice carrying across the hall with the ring of absolute certainty. "After all these years of exile and waiting, we take the first steps on the road that leads to Erebor. Some of us may not live to see the end of that road, but all will be remembered in the songs of our people, and our names will be carved in stone beside those of the great kings of old." A cheer rose from the assembled dwarves, the sound echoing from the walls and ceiling with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient stronghold. And in that cheer was all the joy and fierce pride of a people who had never forgotten their homeland, who had kept alive through all the dark years the flame of hope that one day they would see the halls of their fathers restored to their former glory. The die was cast, the plan set in motion, and across the wide world, the forces of fate began to stir in response to decisions made in a ruined watchtower by desperate folk who dared to dream of reclaiming what had been lost. Whether those dreams would be fulfilled or broken upon the adamant will of Smaug the Mighty remained to be seen. But the first move had been made in a game whose stakes were nothing less than the future of all Middle-earth. Deep beneath the lonely mountain, in chambers carved from living rock by the axes and hammers of Durin's folk in the days of their greatest glory, something stirred that had slumbered for long years in the embrace of gold beyond counting. Smaug the Golden, last of the great fire drakes of the north, felt the first faint tremors of unease ripple through his consciousness, like pebbles cast into the still waters of sleep. The dragon lay coiled upon his bed of treasure, his massive form draped over hills of gold coins and precious gems, his scales gleaming in the dim light that filtered down from the great entrance far above. Each breath that rumbled through his chest sent waves through the surrounding wealth, causing avalanches of silver and gold to cascade down the slopes of his makeshift throne. His eyes were closed, but behind their scaled lids moved dreams of fire and conquest, of the day when his flame had reduced the great city of Dale to ash and cinder, and the proud halls of Erebor had echoed with the screams of the dying. But now, those dreams were troubled by whispers that seemed to come from the very stones of the mountain, voices that spoke of plans and preparations, of exiled kings and secret maps, of quests that would bring danger to his jealously guarded horde. Smaug's great head lifted slightly, one yellow eye opening to scan the darkness that surrounded his lair, searching for any sign of intrusion or threat. "Who dares disturb the sleep of Smaug the Mighty?" he rumbled, his voice like distant thunder rolling through the hollow places of the earth. "What fool thinks to steal from the treasure hoard of the king under the mountain?" No answer came from the shadows, but the dragon's senses, sharpened by centuries of vigilance, detected something that had not been there before. The faintest scent of fear and determination carried on air currents that moved through passages he had thought sealed forever. It was the smell of dwarf sweat and steel, of leather and iron, and the peculiar mustiness that clung to those who had spent long years in exile dreaming of home. Smaug raised his great head fully now, his neck extending like a serpent's, as he tasted the air with senses that could detect the approach of enemies from miles away. His tail lashed behind him, sending cascades of treasure tumbling from the heights of his hoard, and the sound of it was like the beating of war drums in the echoing chambers of the mountain. "So," he hissed, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any roar. "The worms return to their hole, do they? The spawn of Durin think to reclaim what I have taken for my own. They shall learn, as their fathers learned, that the fire of Smaug burns eternal, and that death is the only reward for those who covet the treasures of the dragon." He began to move then, his colossal form uncoiling from the bed of gold with a grace that belied his size. Each movement sent tremors through the mountain's heart, causing rockfalls in distant passages and setting the remaining structures of the dwarf kingdom to swaying like trees in a gale. The sound of his passage was like the roar of a great waterfall, echoing through every hall and corridor, until it seemed that the mountain itself had begun to groan with some vast and terrible pain. As he moved through the ruins of Erebor, Smaug's memory brought back images of the city as it had been in the day of his coming. The great forges blazing with the light of 1,000 fires, the workshops ringing with the sound of hammer on anvil, the galleries filled with the treasures that had made the kingdom under the mountain the envy of all Middle-earth. Now those halls lay empty and cold, their beauty marred by the passage of years and the violence of his conquest. But in the dragon's mind, they remained forever frozen in that moment of triumph when he had claimed them for his own. He paused before the great gates that had once opened to welcome traders and emissaries from distant lands, their massive doors now hanging broken and askew, their gold and silver decorations tarnished by time and neglect. Through the gaps in the stonework, he could see the desolation that had once been Dale, the city of men reduced to rubble and ash by the fury of his flames. It was a sight that filled him with savage satisfaction, a reminder of his power and the fate that awaited any who dared challenge his dominion. But tonight, there was something different in the air, a tension that spoke of forces gathering in the darkness beyond his mountain fortress. Smaug's great eye turned northward, toward the grey mountains, where he knew the exiled dwarves had made their temporary home. His vision pierced the night like a searchlight, seeking some sign of the threat that his instincts told him was approaching. There, movement in the wasteland that surrounded the mountain's base, figures too small and distant to make out clearly, but their presence was undeniable. The dragon's lips drew back in a snarl that revealed teeth like ivory swords, and deep in his throat began the rumble that presaged the unleashing of his terrible fire. "Come then," he whispered to the night wind, his words carrying a promise of destruction that made the very stones of the mountain tremble. "Come and face the wrath of Smaug, the chiefest and greatest of calamities. Come and burn in the fires that have consumed kingdoms and brought low the proud towers of men. I have waited long for worthy prey to venture into my domain, and I hunger for the sport of hunting those who think themselves clever enough to steal from a dragon." He settled back upon his treasure hoard, but his posture was no longer one of rest. Every muscle in his enormous frame was coiled like a spring, ready to launch him into action at the first sign of intrusion. His tail swept back and forth across the gold with a sound like wind through dry leaves, and his claws gouged deep scratches in the ancient stone of the chamber floor. The fire in his belly began to build, the internal furnace that was the source of his terrible breath kindling to life after years of dormancy. The light of it could be seen flickering behind his teeth, and wisps of smoke began to curl from his nostrils, carrying with them the scent of sulfur and burning stone. Soon, he knew, that fire would roar forth in a torrent of flame, hot enough to melt steel and reduce living flesh to ash in the space of a heartbeat. Above him, carved into the ceiling of the great chamber, were images of the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain, greatest of all the treasures that had once graced the halls of Erebor. The great jewel had vanished during the chaos of his conquest, hidden away by some dwarf lord who had thought to preserve it from the dragon's greed. Smaug had searched every corner of the mountain for that prize, but it had eluded him, a reminder that even his victory had not been complete. Perhaps, he mused, his voice a purr of malicious anticipation, my guests will know where that bauble has been hidden. I shall ask them when they lie broken at my feet whether they think their lives are worth the secret of the Arkenstone's location. It will be amusing to see how long their courage lasts when my fire begins to cook the flesh from their bones. The night wore on, and still the dragon waited, his patience as terrible and inexorable as the slow grinding of glaciers across stone. He had learned long ago that anticipation was often sweeter than the act itself, that the fear of prey was as nourishing to his cruel heart as the taste of their blood upon his tongue. Let them come in their own time, these foolish dwarf, the war of the Elves and Sauron, a tale of the Second Age. The night wore on, and still the dragon waited, his patience as terrible and inexorable as the slow grinding of glaciers across stone. He had learned long ago that anticipation was often sweeter than the act itself, that the fear of prey was as nourishing to his cruel heart as the taste of their blood upon his tongue. Let them come in their own time, these foolish dwarves, and whatever allies they had gathered to their cause. When they arrived, he would be ready. In the deepest vaults of the mountain, where the richest veins of gold had once been mined and the greatest treasures stored, Smaug's hoard stretched away into darkness like a sea of gleaming metal and precious stones. Here lay the accumulated wealth of centuries, not merely the treasure of Erebor, but the hordes of lesser dragons he had slain in his youth, the ransoms of conquered cities, the tribute paid by kings who thought gold a fair price for their continued existence. Each piece had its place in the dragon's memory, each coin and jewel catalogued with the obsessive precision that marked his kind. He knew if so much as a single copper piece were moved from its appointed place, could sense the displacement like a wound in his own flesh. It was this knowledge that had kept him secure through all the years of his dominion, the certainty that no thief could take even the smallest bauble without his awareness. But tonight, for perhaps the first time since claiming the mountain, Smaug felt a flicker of something that might almost have been doubt. The whispers that had disturbed his sleep spoke not of crude smash and grab raids like those mounted by desperate men in years past, but of something more subtle, more dangerous. There had been mention of secret ways, of paths unknown to dragon sight, of burglarious skills that might succeed where warriors' strength had failed. Impossible, he growled, his voice echoing through the treasure chambers with the force of absolute conviction. No power in Middle-earth can match the vigilance of Smaug the Terrible. I have guarded this hoard for 60 years, and in all that time, not one piece has been taken from me. Let them come with all their stealth and cunning. They will find that dragon sense pierces every shadow, that dragon fire burns away every hiding place. Yet even as he spoke these words of confidence, the great dragon began to move through his domain with more purpose than he had shown in decades. Through the Hall of Kings, he stalked, his massive form filling the ancient spaces where once the rulers of Erebor had held court in glory unimaginable. His claws clicked against stone floors inlaid with gold and mithril, and his breath misted in the cold air that flowed through passages carved by master craftsmen whose names were now lost to time. In the chamber of Mazabul, where the great record books of the kingdom had once been kept, Smaug paused before the throne of the kings under the mountain. The great seat was carved from a single block of black marble, its arms wrought in the shape of ravens, and its back bearing the tree of Durin, worked in silver and gems. Upon its seat had once rested a cushion of deepest blue, embroidered with the 7 stars that were the emblem of Durin's house, but that had long since crumbled to dust. Soon, the dragon murmured, running one great claw along the throne's armrest with deliberate slowness. Soon the last heir of Durin will kneel before this seat, not as a king returning to claim his birthright, but as a prisoner begging for the mercy that I do not possess. Then will the final chapter of this tedious tale be written, and the line of the mountain kings will end forever in fire and screaming. From the throne room, his path led through the gallery of the ancestors, where once had hung portraits of all the kings who had ruled beneath the mountain since Durin the Deathless first claimed these halls. The paintings were gone now, consumed in the flames of his conquest or destroyed by the mere passage of time, but their empty frames still hung upon the walls like windows into a past that would never return. Smaug studied each empty frame as he passed, his memory supplying the images that were no longer there. Durin himself, stern and mighty, with his great axe gleaming in his hands. 9 the old, who had ruled when the mountain's wealth first began to draw the attention of distant kingdoms. Thror the wealthy, in whose reign the horde had grown to legendary proportions, drawing traders and emissaries from every corner of Middle-earth. All dust now, the dragon said with satisfaction, his voice carrying clearly through the empty hall. All their glory and pride reduced to ash and memory, while I endure eternal. That is the lesson they never learned, that flesh fades and kingdoms fall, but the fire of dragons burns forever. At the easternmost end of the gallery stood the largest frame of all, its golden border worked with images of hammers and anvils, picks and tongs, all the tools of the smith's craft that had been the foundation of Erebor's greatness. This had once held the portrait of Thror in his prime, but now it gaped empty like a mouth opened in an endless scream. It was here that Smaug's restless pacing finally came to a halt, his great eye fixed upon that empty frame as though he could see through it to some vision of the future that pleased him greatly. For he knew, with the prescience that comes to those who have lived long enough to see the patterns that govern the fate of lesser beings, that the tale which had begun with Thror's pride and ended with his exile was not yet complete. Thorin Oakenshield, he spoke the name like a curse, tasting each syllable as though it were poison upon his tongue. Son of Thrain, grandson of Thror, last heir to a throne that exists now only in his dreams. How fitting it will be when he stands before me at last, broken and defeated, his quest for vengeance transformed into the instrument of his own doom. The dragon's laughter echoed through the gallery of ancestors, a sound like the grinding of great millstones mixed with the roar of forge fires. It was a sound that spoke of malice beyond the comprehension of lesser beings, of cruelty refined through centuries of practice into an art form that would have horrified even the Dark Lord in his fortress of Barad-dûr. As dawn broke grey and cold over the desolation of Smaug, the great dragon finally returned to his treasure chamber, settling once more upon his bed of gold with the satisfied air of one who has completed all necessary preparations. The fire in his belly had grown to an inferno that made the air around him shimmer like water, and wisps of smoke leaked from between his teeth with each breath. Let this day bring what it may, he declared to the empty halls around him, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy and doom. I am ready for whatever fools dare to challenge the might of Smaug the Mighty. They will find that dragon fire burns hotter than the forges of Erebor ever did, and that dragon wrath is a force more terrible than all the armies of Middle-earth combined. Outside the mountain, the sun climbed slowly toward its zenith, but within the dragon's lair, darkness reigned eternal, broken only by the malevolent gleam of golden scales and the red glow of eyes that had looked upon the destruction of kingdoms. Smaug the Golden was awake, and all the powers of earth and heaven would not be enough to save those who dared disturb his ancient slumber. The fire was awakened, and Middle-earth trembled. Far to the south and east of the lonely mountain, beyond the brown waters of the river running, and the marshlands where the Gladden fields spread like a green carpet beneath the autumn sky, the foundations of a darker power trembled with anticipation. In Dol Guldur, that fortress of shadow which had grown like a canker upon the fair face of Middle-earth, the necromancer felt the stirring of his ancient enemy and smiled with the cold satisfaction of one whose plans had reached a crucial juncture. From his throne of black iron, wreathed in shadows that seemed to devour light itself, Sauron gazed into the palantir that rested upon its pedestal beside him. The Seeing Stone, one of the 7 that had been made in Númenor before that island's destruction, showed him visions of distant places and times yet to come. Tonight, it revealed to him the lair of Smaug the Golden and the dragon's restless movements as he prepared for the coming of those who would challenge his dominion. "Excellent," whispered the Dark Lord, his voice like the hiss of serpents in a tomb. The worm stirs at last, roused from his long slumber by the approach of prey. Soon the mountain will echo with the sounds of battle, and in that chaos, opportunities will arise that have long been denied to me. Beside the throne stood the mouth of Sauron, chief among the Nazgûl, his form shrouded in robes of midnight blue that seemed to absorb all warmth from the air around them. In the darkness beneath his hood, 2 points of baleful light served as eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried the chill of the grave. "Master," said he, "the time approaches when your design may be fulfilled. The dwarves gather for their desperate assault upon the dragon's lair, and with them goes the Grey Wizard, he who has long stood as a thorn in our path. Shall we move now to ensure that none survive the encounter?" "Patience, my faithful servant," replied Sauron, his attention still fixed upon the visions that swirled within the palantir. Direct intervention would be crude and obvious, alerting our enemies to the true extent of our knowledge and power. No, let events unfold as they will, but ensure that we are positioned to take advantage of whatever outcome emerges. The Seeing Stone's surface rippled like disturbed water, and new images formed within its depths. Now it showed the halls of Khazad-dûm, where the dwarves of Dain Ironfoot delved ever deeper into the roots of the misty mountains, seeking the veins of mithril that ran like silver fire through the living rock. But in the deepest places, where no dwarf had yet ventured, something stirred that had slept since the world was young. "The Balrog wakes," observed Sauron with satisfaction, watching as the ancient demon of shadow and flame began to rouse from its long slumber. Soon the greatest kingdom of the dwarves will face the terror that destroyed their kin in Khazad-dûm of old. When that hour comes, Dain's folk will have little attention to spare for the troubles of their cousins beneath the lonely mountain. "And what of the other realms, Master?" "Gil-galad in Lindon grows suspicious of our activities, and his spies range far through Middle-earth, seeking news of our designs. Should we not move to eliminate this threat while his attention is elsewhere?" The Dark Lord's laughter echoed through the chamber, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the screams of the damned. The High King is indeed a threat, but he is also cautious, bound by the wisdom of ages and the counsel of those who would preserve rather than act. Let him suspect what he will. By the time he moves to open war, our strength will have grown beyond his power to challenge. The Palantir shifted its focus once more, this time revealing the green hills and flowering meadows of the Shire, where the hobbits dwelt in peace and plenty, far removed from the great affairs of kings and wizards. But even in that haven of tranquility, Sauron's sight could perceive the subtle currents of fate that flowed like invisible rivers through the fabric of creation. "Something moves in the west," he murmured, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that had not been there before. "The patterns are shifting in ways I cannot fully comprehend, as though some new element has entered the game that was not accounted for in my calculations. The hobbits, Master. Surely such simple folk pose no threat to your designs. However, their fate may be woven into the greater tapestry of events. Do not dismiss them so easily," warned Sauron, his gaze still fixed upon the peaceful valleys and flowering gardens of the Shire. "I have learned through bitter experience that the smallest players in the great game can sometimes prove the most dangerous, precisely because they are overlooked by those who think only in terms of armies and kingdoms." From the Shire, the Seeing Stone's vision expanded to encompass all of Middle-earth, showing the Dark Lord the disposition of forces across the wide world. In the north, the kingdoms of men grew stronger, their armies better trained and equipped than they had been in centuries past. In the west, the elven realms maintained their ancient watch, their warriors still fierce despite the weariness that came with the passing of ages. In the east and south, the wild tribes stirred at his bidding, their chiefs already won over by promises of gold and conquest. But it was to one particular vision that Sauron's attention returned again and again, a blade of elven make, its surface gleaming with inner light, resting in darkness as though waiting for the hand that would draw it forth in the hour of greatest need. This was Sting, though none yet knew its name, and around it swirled currents of possibility that made even the Dark Lord's ancient wisdom falter. "A blade is forged that will taste orc blood," he whispered, the words seeming to come from some deeper source than conscious thought. "A light shines in darkness that will not be extinguished. A choice approaches that will determine the fate of all who draw breath beneath the sky." "Master." The mouth of Sauron's voice carried a note of concern, for he had never before heard uncertainty in his lord's words. "Nothing," said Sauron, dismissing the vision with an angry gesture. "Merely the shadows of possibilities that may never come to pass. The future remains fluid, shaped by will and choice, and the complex interplay of forces that even I cannot fully predict." But even as he spoke these words of dismissal, the Dark Lord's mind was troubled by what he had seen. For in that brief glimpse of the blade called Sting, he had sensed something that filled him with unease, a purity of purpose, a clarity of intent that reminded him uncomfortably of the light that had shone from Arendil's Silmaril in the ancient days when the world was younger and hope burned brighter in the hearts of the free peoples. "Summon the Nine," he commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "Let them ride forth upon their dread errands, searching always for that which was lost. The time draws near when all must be gathered to the test, and I would have my most faithful servants where they can strike most swiftly when the moment comes." The Nazgul bowed low, his form seeming to waver like smoke in a breeze. "It shall be as you command, Master. But what of the assault upon the mountain? Should we not intervene to ensure that Smaug fulfills his purpose in your design?" "The dragon needs no guidance from us," replied Sauron with contempt. "His greed and pride will serve our ends better than any command we might give. Let him face the dwarves and their wizard companion without interference from us. If he triumphs, we gain time to complete our preparations. If he falls, we gain access to treasures that have long been denied to us. And if the Mountain Kingdom is restored, if Thorin Oakenshield succeeds in his quest, and Erebor stands once more as a beacon of hope for the free peoples." The Dark Lord's eyes blazed with sudden fury, and the temperature in the chamber dropped until frost began to form upon the walls. "Then we shall teach the world the price of defying the will of Sauron the Great. No kingdom, however mighty, can stand forever against the tide of darkness that rises from the south. If the dwarves reclaim their mountain, they will merely provide us with a more satisfying target for our wrath." Throughout the remainder of that night, messengers departed from Dol Guldur, carrying orders to the Dark Lord's servants scattered across the width and breadth of Middle-earth. In the depths of Moria, agents of the enemy whispered to the Balrog of targets that would soon present themselves for its terrible vengeance. In the fortress cities of the south, orc chieftains received weapons and gold, along with promises of greater rewards to come. In the wild lands beyond the Sea of Rhûn, the Easterling tribes were reminded of old grievances against the Western kingdoms and encouraged to sharpen their swords for war. But it was the 9 Nazgûl who received the most crucial mission of all. At the grey hour before dawn, they rode forth from the gates of Dol Guldur upon horses whose eyes burned with hellfire and whose hoofbeats left no mark upon the earth. Their destination was secret, their purpose known only to their master, but their passing filled all who glimpsed them with a terror that lingered long after they had vanished into the distance. "Seek," Sauron had commanded them. "Search every road and path, every hidden valley and forgotten ruin. The Ring of Power endures somewhere in this world, and I will have it found. Bring me news of its location, and your reward shall be beyond measure. Fail me in this task, and you will learn that there are fates worse even than the undeath that now claims you." As the sun rose red through the smoke that perpetually shrouded Dol Guldur, the necromancer stood upon the highest tower of his fortress, gazing out over the wide world with eyes that saw all things, fair and foul alike, as instruments to be used in the service of his will. Soon he knew the various threads of his design would begin to draw together, weaving a web of consequence that would trap all his enemies in bonds of their own making. The blade was not yet drawn, but already he could feel its weight in the balance of fate. Somewhere in the green lands of the West, choices were being made that would echo through all the ages of the Sa'ada world, and though he could not see their end clearly, he sensed that they would bring him either complete victory or utter defeat. "Let them come," he whispered to the morning wind. "Let all who oppose me gather their strength and make their stand. In the end, darkness will triumph, for I am Sauron the Great, and my will shall not be denied." The sun climbed higher in the sky, but around Dol Guldur, the shadows only deepened, as though the very light of day recoiled from that place of malice and despair. And in the dungeons far below, Thrain, son of Thror, wept tears that had long since ceased to fall, mourning not only for his own torment, but for the doom that he sensed approaching all who still dared to love the light. The battle of 5 armies raged for 3 days upon the fields before the gates of Erebor, and when at last the eagles of the misty mountains descended from their eyries to join the fray, the tide of war turned decisively against the forces of darkness. Azog the Defiler lay dead upon the blood-soaked earth, his head severed by the blade of Thorin Oakenshield in single combat, and with him fell the great host of orcs and goblins that had descended from the northern wastes to claim the dragon's hoard for their own. But victory came at a terrible price, as victory always does when free folk stand against the shadow. Thorin himself had fallen, mortally wounded in his duel with the orc chieftain, and as he lay dying in the halls of his fathers, his nephews Fili and Kylie beside him, the restored king under the mountain spoke words that would be remembered long after his name had passed into legend. "I go now to the halls of waiting," he whispered, his hand clasped in that of Bilbo Baggins, the unlikely burglar whose courage had made possible the reclaiming of the kingdom. "But I have seen the mountain restored to its glory, and that is enough. Rule well, Dain, my cousin, and remember that the greatest treasure of any kingdom is not gold or gems, but the loyalty of those who call it home." So passed Thorin Oakenshield, son of Thrain, grandson of Thror, the last of the direct line of Durin to sit upon the throne beneath the mountain. He was buried with kingly honours in the deepest vaults of Erebor, and upon his tomb were carved runes that spoke of his courage and his sacrifice, while beside him lay the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain, which had been his birthright and his burden. Dain Ironfoot, lord of the Iron Hills, took up the crown of his fallen cousin and ruled thereafter as king under the mountain. And under his wise governance, the kingdom began to flourish once more. The forges were rekindled, their fires casting dancing shadows upon walls that had known only darkness for 60 years. The workshops rang again with the sound of hammer upon anvil, as master craftsmen who had preserved their skills through long years of exile passed their knowledge to a new generation of apprentices. From Dale, the city of men began to rise again from its ashes, built anew upon the ruins of the old. Bard the bowman, he who had slain Smaug the Golden with a single arrow guided by the spirits of his ancestors, was acclaimed as King of Dale, and under his rule, the lakemen and the scattered folk of the region found new hope and purpose. Trade flowed once more between mountain and city, and the sound of children's laughter was heard again in streets that had known only silence since the dragon's coming. But even as the free peoples celebrated their victory and mourned their fallen, darker powers moved in the shadows beyond their sight. In Dol Guldur, the necromancer received news of Smaug's death with neither surprise nor dismay, for the dragon's fate had always been woven into the greater pattern of his design. Indeed, the great worm's passing served his purposes well, for now the way lay open to treasures that had long been beyond his reach. "The dragon is dead," reported the mouth of Sauron, his spectral voice echoing through the throne chamber where shadows gathered like living things. Slain by a mortal man with a single arrow, though many had thought him invulnerable to any weapon forged by lesser hands. "Smaug was indeed mighty," replied the Dark Lord, his form wreathed in darkness upon his iron throne, "but he was also proud, and pride has ever been the weakness of dragons. His death changes nothing in the great design, save that certain obstacles are now removed from our path. The palantir beside the throne flared with sudden light, showing visions of the celebrations that filled the halls of Erebor and the rebuilding that had begun in Dale. But Sauron's attention was fixed not upon these scenes of restoration and hope, but upon something smaller and more subtle, a figure moving through the crowds with quiet purpose, his small stature and simple clothing marking him as different from the warriors and kings who surrounded him. "The burglar," whispered Sauron, his voice carrying a note of interest that had not been there before. "He bears something of great import, though he knows not its true nature. Show me, faithful stone, what treasure does the halfling carry in the depths of his pocket?" But the palantir's surface remained dark, as though some power greater than the Dark Lord's will protected the hobbit from his sight. Sauron's eyes blazed with sudden fury, and the air in the chamber grew thick with malice that pressed against the walls like a living thing. "There is a veil drawn across my sight," he snarled, his fist striking the arm of his throne with such force that cracks appeared in the black iron. "Some power works against me, hiding from my knowledge that which I most desire to see. But no matter, time will reveal all secrets, and when it does, I shall be ready to claim what is rightfully mine." In the weeks that followed the Battle of Five Armies, emissaries from many lands came to Erebor to pay homage to the restored kingdom and to renew the ancient alliances that had bound the free peoples together in darker days. From Lothlorien came Celebrimbor the Wise, bearing gifts of elven craft and words of friendship from the Lady Galadriel. From the woodland realm rode Legolas, son of Thranduil, leading a company of his father's finest warriors to stand guard upon the borders of the Mountain Kingdom. But it was the arrival of Gandalf the Grey that brought the greatest joy to those who dwelt beneath the mountain, for the wizard had been sorely missed during the dark days of the battle, having been called away on urgent business that he would not name. When he appeared at the gates of Erebor, travel-stained and weary, his grey robes torn and his staff bearing new scars, all could see that he had faced perils no less dangerous than those that had threatened the Mountain Kingdom. "Welcome, Gandalf Greyheim," said King Dain, greeting the wizard in the great hall where once Thror had held court in the days of Erebor's first glory. "Your absence was felt keenly in our hour of greatest need, though I doubt not that your business was of vital importance to the cause of all free folk." "Indeed it was," replied Gandalf, gravely, accepting the seat of honor that was offered to him. "For while you fought valiantly against the forces of darkness here, I was engaged in a different battle entirely, one that struck at the very roots of the shadow that has long threatened all Middle-earth." The wizard's tale of the White Council's assault upon Dol Guldur brought gasps of amazement from his listeners, for few had imagined that such mighty powers had been moving in secret while the Mountain Kingdom fought for its very survival. He spoke of the breaking of the necromancer's power, of the cleansing of the evil fortress, and of the flight of the dark spirit that had dwelt there into the eastern lands beyond the reach of their immediate concern. "So the shadow is lifted at last," said Dain with satisfaction, raising his goblet in salute to the wizard's deeds. "Middle-earth is free of the malice that has long poisoned the fair lands of the south, and our children may grow to maturity without fear of the darkness that threatened their fathers." But Gandalf's expression remained grave, and when he spoke again, His words carried a weight of prophecy that chilled the hearts of all who heard them. "The shadow is driven back, but not destroyed," he said quietly. The necromancer was indeed Sauron returned, though diminished from his former might. And though his fortress is broken and his servants scattered, he himself has escaped to fight another day. "Where has he fled?" asked Legolas, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his long white knife. Surely the combined might of the White Council could track him to whatever new lair he has chosen for himself. "To Mordor," replied Gandalf, and at the speaking of that accursed name, a silence fell upon the hall like the shadow of great wings passing overhead. "To the Shah, Blackland, where he first raised his tower and forged the Ring of Power in the fires of Mount Doom. There, behind the barrier of the Mountains of Shadow, he will begin the work of rebuilding his strength, and when next he emerges, it will be with power far greater than any he wielded from Dol Guldur." The revelation cast a shadow over the celebrations that should have marked the restoration of the Mountain Kingdom, for all who heard Gandalf's words understood that their victory, however complete it might seem, was but the first movement in a symphony of war that would test the courage of all free folk in the years to come. Yet hope was not entirely extinguished, for the reclaiming of Erebor had proved that even the mightiest enemies could be overthrown when free people stood together in defense of all they held dear. The Mountain Kingdom stood restored, a beacon of light in a world where shadows gathered, and its gates were open to all who sought alliance against the darkness that would surely come. In the weeks that followed, as winter settled upon the northern lands and the first snows began to fall upon the peaks of the lonely mountain, messengers rode forth from Erebor, carrying word to every corner of Middle-earth. To Gil-galad in Lindon went news of the victory and an offer of alliance in the trials that lay ahead. To Elrond in Rivendell went scholars and lawmasters, seeking knowledge of the ancient days when Sauron had last walked openly in Middle-earth. To the kingdoms of men went promises of support and trade, cementing bonds that would prove crucial in the darkness to come. And to the Shire, most precious of messages was carried by Bilbo Baggins himself, who had chosen to return to his beloved Bag End rather than accept the king's offer of a permanent place of honor in the Mountain Kingdom. The Hobbit bore with him not only tales of adventure that would astound his neighbors for years to come, but something far more precious, a simple gold ring that he had found in the depths of goblin tunnels, whose true nature was hidden even from his own understanding. As he walked the familiar paths of the Shire, breathing in the scent of growing things and listening to the comfortable sounds of a land at peace, Bilbo could not have imagined that the ring in his pocket would one day prove the key to the fate of all Middle-earth. For the present, it was enough that he was home, that the great adventure was over, and that he could return to the simple pleasures of a well-ordered life. But in the east, beyond the Mountains of Shadow, Sauron the Great began the work of rebuilding Barad-dûr, and the sound of his hammers echoed through the wasteland of Mordor, like the beating of a great heart awakening from sleep. The kingdom was reclaimed, but the war for Middle-earth had only just begun. In the autumn following the restoration of Erebor, when the leaves turned gold and red upon the trees and the first chill winds spoke of winter's approach, Bilbo Baggins sat in his study at Bag End, quill in hand, struggling to find words for the final chapter of his tale. Before him lay sheets of parchment covered with his careful script, telling the story of his unexpected journey and the part he had played in the reclaiming of the lonely mountain. And so, he murmured to himself, dipping his quill once more in the inkwell, I come at last to the ending of the matter, though whether it be a true ending or merely the close of one chapter in a longer tale, I cannot say. The study was warm and comfortable, lit by the cheerful glow of a fire crackling in the grate and the steady light of several well-trimmed lamps. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings speaking of years of careful reading and the accumulation of knowledge that comes to those who love learning for its own sake. Maps hung between the bookcases, some showing the familiar boundaries of the Shire and its neighbours, others depicting distant lands that most hobbits had never heard of, much less seen with their own eyes. But it was to one particular map that Bilbo's gaze returned again and again as he wrote, a detailed rendering of the lands around the lonely mountain, marked with the route he had taken in company with Thorin Oakenshield and his band of dwarves. Each landmark brought back memories of that strange and wonderful adventure. The goblin tunnels where he had first met Gollum and won the riddle contest that had changed his life forever. The misty mountains where they had nearly perished in a storm. The house of Bjorn, the skin changer, where they had found rest and healing. The dark depths of Mirkwood, where spiders large as ponies had tried to make meals of them all. Most vivid of all was his memory of Smaug the Golden, that terrible and magnificent dragon whose death had made possible the restoration of the Dwarf Kingdom. Even now, safe in his hobbit hole with the familiar sounds of the Shire all around him, Bilbo could recall every detail of that encounter. The vast chamber filled with treasure beyond counting, the sulphurous reek of dragon breath, the intelligence that had blazed in those great yellow eyes like flames in the darkness. He was magnificent, the hobbit said aloud, his voice carrying a note of wonder that had not diminished with the passage of time. Terrible beyond description, evil to the very core of his being, but magnificent nonetheless. I shall never see his like again, and perhaps that is for the best. As he wrote, Bilbo's hand moved unconsciously to his waistcoat pocket, where a simple gold ring rested forgotten by all save himself. He had told no one of the ring, not even Gandalf, though he could not have said precisely why he felt the need to keep its existence secret. It seemed such a small thing compared to the great events he had witnessed, hardly worth mentioning in a tale filled with dragons and battles, kings and treasure beyond measure. Yet sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night when sleep eluded him, Bilbo found himself thinking about the ring and the strange circumstances of its finding. He remembered the dark pool where Gollum had dwelt, the riddle contest that had saved his life, and the moment when his groping fingers had closed upon the smooth gold band that had somehow ended up in his pocket. The creature had been frantic when he discovered the ring was missing, calling it his precious, and searching for it with the desperation of one who had lost the thing he valued most in all the world. Poor creature, Bilbo murmured, his tender heart moved to pity, even for so wretched a being as Gollum. He must have treasured it greatly to be so distressed by its loss. But finders keepers, as they say, and he did lose the riddle contest fairly. Still, I cannot help but wonder what made it so precious to him. It seems ordinary enough, though it does have the most peculiar property of making the wearer invisible. The ring's power of invisibility had served Bilbo well during his adventure, allowing him to escape from goblin tunnels, spy upon his enemies, and even steal past the great dragon himself in the heart of the Lonely Mountain. It was a useful enchantment, certainly, but hardly unique in the annals of Middle-earth, where elven cloaks and dwarven rings and wizard staffs all possess their own forms of magic. What Bilbo did not know, could not know, was that the ring resting so innocuously in his pocket was the greatest weapon of evil ever forged, the one ring of power created by Sauron, the Dark Lord, in the fires of Mount Doom, to be master over all other rings. Into that simple band of gold had been poured all the malice and will to dominate that burned in the at mention of the dragon and the Lost Kingdom. Thorin's eyes blazed with an inner fire, and his hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword. "Do you counsel me to attempt the reclaiming of Erebor?" he asked, his voice tight with the effort of keeping his emotions in check. "For if you do, know that I have thought of little else since the day we fled from the mountain, and my heart burns with the desire to look once more upon the halls of my fathers." "The time may come," said Gandalf carefully, "when such an attempt would serve not only your people's need for a homeland, but the greater cause of all free folk. A dwarf kingdom restored beneath the Lonely Mountain would stand as a barrier against the darkness spreading from the south, and Smaug's horde might provide the wealth needed to arm the hosts of the free peoples." Long into the night they spoke, wizard and exiled king, while the wind howled through the peaks of the grey mountains and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient courses. And though no firm plans were made that night, seeds were planted that would one day grow into deeds of great renown. When the hour came for bold hearts to attempt the impossible in the face of overwhelming odds. From the grey mountains, Gandalf's path led him east and south, through the wild lands that lay between the great rivers, where few dwelt save wandering companies of men who owed allegiance to no king. These were hard folk, weathered by constant struggle against orc raids and the other perils of the wilderness. But their hearts were free, and their swords were sharp, and the wizard knew that they would not bend easily to any Dark Lord's will. Yet even among these hardy people, he found signs of the growing shadow. Traders spoke of strange lights seen in the southern sky, and of beasts that had fled from the woods near Dol Guldur, as though driven by some great fear. Shepherds reported that their flocks grew restless at nightfall, huddling together and refusing to graze in certain valleys where once they had pastured without concern. Most troubling of all were the tales of the Black Riders, the Nazgul who rode upon their dread errands through the darkness. Few who saw them lived to tell the tale, but those who did spoke of a terror beyond description, of riders whose very presence drained hope from the heart and filled the mind with visions of despair. In the town of Laketown, built upon the waters of the Long Lake in the shadow of the Lonely Mountain, Gandalf found the people living in daily fear of the dragon that dwelt so near. Smaug the Golden had not been seen for many years, but his presence was felt like a weight upon the air, and none dared venture too close to the mountain, lest they rouse the wrath of the great worm. The master of Laketown was a man grown fat on trade and comfortable in his power, but his eyes held the furtive look of one who knows that his prosperity rests upon uncertain foundations. When Gandalf spoke to him of the need to prepare for darker times ahead, the master nodded and made suitable noises of agreement. But the wizard could see that his thoughts were fixed only upon the wealth that flowed through his domain, not upon the greater perils that threatened all the lands of Middle-earth. "These are hard times indeed," said the master, his voice oily with false concern. "But surely the great lords of the West will protect us simple folk from whatever evils may arise. We are but merchants and fishermen, with neither the strength nor the wisdom to stand against the powers of darkness." Gandalf studied the man carefully, seeing in him the weakness that would make the realms of men vulnerable to corruption and betrayal. "Evil does not always come with sword and flame," he said quietly. "Sometimes it comes with promises of wealth and easy victory, offering to protect what men hold dear in exchange for their freedom and their souls." The master laughed, a sound like coins jingling in a pouch, but his eyes did not meet the wizard's gaze. "You speak in riddles, Grey Pilgrim, but I am a practical man. Show me gold, and I will believe in prosperity. Show me armies, and I will believe in war. But these shadows and whispers you speak of, they are no concern of mine." From Lake Town, Gandalf travelled north to Dale, the great city that had once stood proud and fair at the foot of the lonely mountain, but now lay in ruins, its streets choked with rubble and its walls blackened by dragon fire. Among the broken stones, a few hardy folk had returned to scrape out a living from the ruins of their ancestors' glory, but they were poor and scattered, lacking the strength to rebuild what had been lost. Yet in their eyes, Gandalf saw something that had been missing in the Master of Lake Town: the stubborn courage of those who endure despite all hardship, who cling to hope even when all seems lost. These were the descendants of the men of Dale who had fought beside the dwarves in the days of Erebor's glory, and though their city lay in ruins, their spirits remained unbroken. "One day," said an old man who remembered the city in its prime, his weathered hands tracing the outline of fallen walls, "one day the king will return to the mountain, and Dale will rise again from its ashes. The dragon cannot live forever, and when he is gone, we will rebuild what was destroyed and make it greater than before." Gandalf looked upon the ruins and saw in his mind's eye the city as it had been, proud towers reaching toward the sky and broad avenues filled with the laughter of children. And he saw too what it might become again if hope proved stronger than despair and courage greater than fear. "Perhaps," he said softly, his words carrying a weight of prophecy that the old man could not quite understand, "that day is closer than you think. For I have met one who bears the blood of kings, and in his heart burns a fire that no dragon's flame can quench." As autumn deepened into winter, Gandalf's journeys brought him at last to the borders of the Shire, that green and pleasant land where the hobbits dwelt in peace and plenty, far removed from the great affairs of kings and wizards. Here the shadows seemed lighter, the air cleaner, as though the simple goodness of the halfling folk served as a barrier against the malice that spread from Dol Guldur. In Hobbiton he paused, drawn by memories of happier times when the world seemed younger and hope burned brighter in the hearts of all free folk. The village lay quiet beneath its blanket of snow, smoke rising from 100 chimneys to form a haze of warmth and comfort above the rounded roofs of the hobbit holes. Children played in the lanes, their laughter bright as silver bells, while their elders went about their daily tasks with the unhurried contentment of those who know their place in the world and are satisfied with it. Yet even here, in this haven of peace, Gandalf could sense the first faint stirrings of the change that was coming. Some of the older hobbits spoke of strange dreams that troubled their sleep, and of a restlessness that had come upon certain of their young folk, as though they heard distant drums calling them to adventures they could not name. It was a subtle thing, hardly noticeable to any but one who knew what signs to look for, but the wizard recognized it as the first ripple of the great wave that would one day sweep across all Middle-earth. Standing upon the hill above Hobbiton, looking out over the peaceful fields and gardens of the Shire, Gandalf felt the weight of knowledge heavy upon his heart, for he alone among the inhabitants of that fair land knew what storms were gathering beyond their borders, and he wondered whether this green sanctuary would prove strong enough to weather the tempests that lay ahead. "Enjoy your peace while you may, little folk," he whispered to the wind, "for the time comes when even the Shire will not be safe from the malice that spreads across the world. But perhaps, in that dark hour, your simple courage will shine brighter than all the wisdom of the wise, and in your small hands will rest the hope of all the peoples of Middle-earth." The fortress of Dol Guldur stood cleansed beneath the pale light of Erendil's star, its blackened stones washed clean by rain that fell like tears from the heavens. Where once the necromancer's tower had pierced the sky like a dagger thrust into the heart of Mirkwood, now only broken walls remained, their malice spent, their shadows fled. Gil-galad walked among the ruins with measured steps, his hand resting upon the hilt of Aeglos, though no enemy remained to face. The spear that had pierced the darkness now gleamed silver in the starlight, its blade unmarked by shadow, for the light of the Eldar burns away all corruption it touches. Yet the elven king's eyes were troubled, for victory in war oft brings burdens heavier than defeat. "He is gone," spoke Elrond, approaching through the rubble with silent grace. The herald of Gil-galad bore upon his brow the light of Erendil, and in his eyes dwelt the wisdom of one who had looked upon both the blessed shores of Valinor and the cursed lands of Mordor. The servants of the enemy flee eastward like smoke before the wind. Dol Guldur is empty of malice. "Empty, yes," Gil-galad replied, his voice carrying the weight of ages, "but not destroyed. For how does one destroy that which was never truly here? We have cleansed these stones of their darkness, herald mine, yet the darkness itself has merely departed. The wind that stirred the broken stones brought with it whispers of an older dread. In the distance, beyond the borders of the cleansed wood, lay Mordor, that land of shadow which had been prepared in secret through long years of seeming peace. There the true stronghold of Sauron, the deceiver, had grown in power while the wise pursued his lesser works, and there his armies gathered like storm clouds upon the horizon of the world. The necromancer was but a mask," continued Gil-galad, gazing eastward toward that distant threat. "Behind it stood one whose true name we feared to speak, whose true purpose we failed to grasp until the hour grew late. He has withdrawn from this place, not in defeat, but in readiness. The shadow that ruled here was but the rehearsal for a greater darkness." Galadriel emerged from the deeper ruins, her golden hair catching what little light remained in the grey hour before dawn. In her hand she bore Nenya, the ring of water, though its power was hidden from all eyes save those of the wise. Her face was fair and terrible to look upon, for she had gazed into the very heart of the enemy's malice, and had seen there the shape of wars yet to come. "I have walked these halls that once echoed with fell voices," she said, her words falling like drops of crystal water upon stone. "I have seen the palantir that once rested in the highest chamber, through which the deceiver spoke with distant servants. It is gone now, carried away in the retreat, but its purpose was fulfilled. Through 9 long centuries, he watched and waited, learning the movements of all who opposed him, counting our numbers, marking our weaknesses. Then we have won nothing but time," said Elrond, though his voice held no despair, for the wise know that time itself may be the greatest of all victories. And perhaps not even that. "We have won something greater than time," Gil-galad corrected, turning from his contemplation of the eastern darkness. "We have won knowledge. No longer may the enemy work in secret, hidden behind the mask of the necromancer. No longer may he strike from shadow while we debate his very existence. The war that is coming, for come it shall, as surely as winter follows autumn, will be fought in the clear light of truth." The 3 members of the White Council stood in silence among the ruins, each lost in contemplation of the magnitude of what they had discovered. The war against the necromancer had been but a skirmish in a conflict that would shake the very foundations of Middle-earth. Yet in their silence was not despair, but the grim resolve of those who have gazed into the abyss and chosen still to stand against it. From the east came no sound of retreat, no thunder of marching armies. The enemy's withdrawal was complete, his servants scattered like leaves before a great wind. Yet in that very silence lay a threat more terrible than any army, for it spoke of preparations made in secret places, of plans laid in darkness, of a power gathering itself for a blow that would be felt from the grey havens to the shores of Rhûn. "He goes to Mordor," Galadriel said at last, her voice barely more than a whisper, yet in it was the certainty of prophecy. "There he will gather his strength and forge his malice into weapons of war. The shadow that rested here was but the seed. In that accursed land it shall grow into a tree whose branches will darken all the sky. Then let us prepare for the harvest of that darkness," Gil-galad replied, his voice firm with resolve. "If the enemy would reveal himself at last, then we shall meet him with all the power and wisdom at our command. The light of the Eldar has not failed in all the long years since the elder days, and it shall not fail now." They departed Dol Guldur as the first light of dawn touched the treetops of Mirkwood, riding westward toward Rivendell, where the White Council would meet in secret session. Behind them, the cleansed fortress stood empty in the growing light, its stones already beginning to crack and crumble as nature reclaimed what evil had corrupted. Yet in the deeper chambers, in the very roots of stone, something stirred still. Not malice, but memory, the echo of words spoken in the black speech, and dreams dreamed in shadow. For though the enemy had withdrawn, his mark upon the world was not so easily erased. In the years to come, other powers would look upon the ruins of Dol Guldur and remember what had been wrought there. The shadow had lifted, but its image remained burned into the very fabric of the world, a scar that would ache whenever darkness gathered and evil stirred. And in Mordor, in the depths of Mount Doom, where the fires of creation still burned with unquenched flame, the Dark Lord Sauron bent his will toward the forging of the One Ring, that golden band which would be the vessel of his malice and the instrument of his dominion. The retreat from Dol Guldur had been but a strategic withdrawal, the gathering of scattered forces before the final assault upon the freedom of Middle-earth. The war was coming, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons, and in its wake would come an age of sorrow, such as the world had not known since the first age ended in flame and ruin. 5 years had passed since the cleansing of Dol Guldur, and the world had grown quieter, as if holding its breath before some great storm. In Rivendell, Elrond kept watch over the borders of his realm, while in Lothlorien, Galadriel gazed often into her mirror, seeing there glimpses of futures both fair and fell. Yet it was Gil-galad who bore the heaviest burden, for upon his shoulders rested the defense of all the free lands of Middle-earth. On this evening, as autumn painted the leaves of linden in shades of gold and crimson, the Elven King sat in his study, surrounded by maps and scrolls that told the tale of a world in shadow. Reports had come from the Southlands of strange movements in Mordor, of lights seen in the night where no lights should be, of the earth itself trembling as if something great stirred in the depths. The ring of fire, Vilya, rested upon his finger, its power hidden, but its weight a constant reminder of the responsibility he bore. A soft knock upon his door drew him from his contemplation. "Enter," he called, and was surprised to see not Elrond or one of his counselors, but a hobbit, small even for his kind, with sandy hair and eyes that held depths of wisdom unexpected in one so young in the reckoning of years. "My lord Gil-galad," the hobbit said, bowing deeply, though there was no subservience in the gesture, only respect freely given. "I am Bilbo Baggins of the Shire, though I suspect you know this already." Indeed, Gil-galad knew well of the hobbit who had travelled with dwarves to the Lonely Mountain, who had found a certain golden ring in the dark tunnels beneath the misty mountains, and who had played a part in the downfall of Smaug the Mighty. More than this, the Elven King knew what even Bilbo himself did not suspect, that the simple gold band the hobbit carried was in truth the Master Ring, the foundation of all Sauron's power and the key to either the salvation or the damnation of Middle-earth. "Welcome to Lindon, Bilbo Baggins," Gil-galad said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of his kind, "though I confess myself curious as to what brings a hobbit of the Shire to my halls in these troubled times." Bilbo shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving unconsciously to his waistcoat pocket where the ring lay hidden. "I have been having dreams, my lord, strange dreams of fire and shadow, of a great eye that searches always searching. And in these dreams, I hear a voice speaking words I do not understand, yet somehow the meaning is clear. It speaks of rings and power, of dominion over all the peoples of Middle-earth." The Elven King's eyes grew grave, for he recognized in the hobbit's words the signs of the ring's growing power. Even now, as Sauron gathered his strength in Mordor, the Master Ring called to its maker, and its influence upon its bearer grew ever stronger. "Tell me of these dreams," Gil-galad said gently, gesturing for Bilbo to take a seat by the fire. "Leave out no detail, however small it may seem." For the next hour, Bilbo spoke of visions that came to him in sleep, of a great fortress of iron and flame, of armies that darkened the very sky, of a golden ring that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. He spoke of waking in the night with tears upon his cheeks, though he could not say why he wept. and of a growing sense that some great change was coming to the world, a change that would touch even the quiet fields of the Shire. "I know I am but a simple hobbit," Bilbo concluded, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I have no wisdom of the ancient days, no knowledge of the powers that move in darkness. Yet I feel as though I stand upon the edge of a great precipice, and one false step will send me tumbling into an abyss from which there is no return." Gil-galad was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed upon the flames that danced in the hearth. In those flames, he seemed to see reflections of a greater fire, the flame that burned in the heart of Mount Doom, where the ring of power had been forged, and where, perhaps, it might yet be unmade. "You are wiser than you know, Bilbo Baggins," he said at last, "and braver too, for you have come seeking answers to questions that most would flee from. The dreams you describe are true visions, glimpses of a darkness that even now gathers its strength for war. The voice you hear is that of Sauron the Deceiver, who was once the necromancer of Dol Guldur and is now revealed in his true malice." Bilbo's face grew pale, yet he did not flinch from the truth. "And the ring in my dreams? The golden ring that seems to call to something in the darkness?" Here, Gil-galad hesitated, for the burden of knowledge is often heavier than the burden of ignorance. Yet in the hobbit's eyes, he saw a strength that belied his humble appearance, a courage that had carried him through the dragon's lair and would, perhaps, carry him through trials yet to come. "The ring you saw," Gil-galad said carefully, "is real. It is the master of all the rings of power, the foundation upon which Sauron's dominion rests. While it endures, he cannot be truly defeated. While it is lost to him, he cannot achieve complete victory. It is both the source of his strength and the key to his undoing." Understanding dawned in Bilbo's eyes, terrible and clear. His hand moved again to his pocket, and Gil-galad saw him shudder as he felt the weight of the simple gold band that was, in truth, the most dangerous object in all Middle-earth. "I have it," Bilbo whispered. "Don't I? The ring from my dreams. I carry it with me." Gil-galad nodded gravely. "You do, and in carrying it, you have become perhaps the most important person in all the world, though the world knows it not. The fate of all free peoples may rest upon your shoulders, Bilbo Baggins of the Shire." They sat in silence then, the elven king and the hobbit, each contemplating the magnitude of what had been revealed. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves of autumn, and somewhere in the distance, a bird sang a song of endings and beginnings. "What must I do?" Bilbo asked at last, his voice steady despite the fear that Gil-galad could see in his eyes. "For now, nothing," Gil-galad replied. "Keep the ring safe and secret. Trust no one with knowledge of what you carry, save perhaps Gandalf the Grey, who has long suspected the truth. The time will come when the ring must be dealt with, when it must be either mastered or destroyed. But that time is not yet. Until then, guard it well, and guard yourself better still, for the enemy's eye turns ever toward those who possess what he desires." Bilbo nodded slowly, then rose from his chair with the bearing of one who has accepted a burden too great for mortal shoulders, yet carries it nonetheless. "I understand, my lord. I shall do as you counsel, though I confess the weight of this knowledge seems heavier than any burden I have borne." "The heaviest burdens are often carried by the smallest hands," Gil-galad said gently. "It has ever been so in the turning of the great events of the world. Take comfort in this. You do not bear this burden alone. All who love freedom and life stand with you, whether they know it or not." After Bilbo had departed, returning to the Shire with his terrible secret intact, Gil-galad stood long upon his balcony, gazing eastward toward the distant shadow of Mordor. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, unchanged since the music of creation first gave them birth. Yet beneath their light the world was changing, preparing for a conflict that would determine the fate of all Middle-earth. In Mordor, Sauron bent his will toward the completion of his great work, the forging of the Master Ring that would bind all others to his will. In the Shire, a simple hobbit sat by his fireside, unknowing that he carried in his pocket the very thing his enemy sought. And in Rivendell, Lothlorien, and all the hidden places where the wise and the good made their homes, preparations began for a war that would eclipse all the conflicts that had come before. Yet in this hour of gathering darkness, Gil-galad found within himself not despair, but hope. For he had seen courage in the heart of a simple hobbit, had witnessed the power of goodness to endure in the face of overwhelming malice. The road ahead would be long and dark, filled with sorrow and loss, yet it would not be walked alone. Somewhere in the west, beyond the grey havens, the undying lands waited in eternal peace. Someday, when his tasks in Middle-earth were complete, Gil-galad would take ship for those blessed shores and find rest at last. But that day was yet far off. Until then, he would stand guard over the world he loved, protecting it from the darkness that sought to devour all light and life. The war was coming, as inevitable as the sunrise. Yet in the small courage of small folk, in the wisdom of the wise, and in the enduring light of the Eldar, hope remained. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the world, hope is enough to kindle a flame that no shadow can extinguish. In the years that would follow, that flame would be tested as never before, carried by the most unlikely of heroes through perils beyond imagining. Yet it would endure, as light always endures, until at last the darkness was driven back and Middle-earth knew peace once more. But that is a tale for another telling, in another hour, when the world has need of such stories. For now, it is enough to know that hope survived the longest night, carried in the hearts of those who refused to surrender to despair. And in the Shire, as autumn deepened toward winter, Bilbo Baggins sat by his fire and wrote in his journal of dragon gold and mountain kings, never knowing that he held in his hands both the doom and the salvation of the world.